Still got a lot of people that practice a lot of cognitive dissonance, unfortunately, guys. And they still try to debate the word swarthy to me. It doesn't just mean a tan, all right? I've shown so many different dictionaries and etymology pages, books, showing you what it really means and how it got applied in different ways. And in different ways to dark-skinned people, which includes so-called black people throughout history. We ain't gonna pretend this ain't real. We can't practice cognitive dissonance when it's right in front of you. Swarthy or black. All right, we're in the American Dictionary of the English Language, intended to exhibit one, the origin, affinities, and primary signification of English words, okay? We're in volume 2 of this, Webster's 1828 dictionary, okay? And once again, swart, to make tawny. Swartly, duskly with a tawny hue. Swarthiness, tawniness, a dusky or dark complexion. Swarthy. Definition A, or 1, being of a dark hue or dusky complexion, tawny. In warm climates, the complexion of men is universally swarthy or black. Swarthy or so-called black. There is no black. Ain't nobody black. That's the crayon color. But either way, you know what they mean. The Moors, right? The Moors are swarthy. The Moors, Spaniards, and Italians are more swarthy than the French, German, and English. That's what they say here in 1828. I guess they forgot what Benjamin Franklin said in 1750. You know, let's not use crayon colors to refer to people and generalize. You know, let's just try to learn and let them learn. Let these people who are ignorant, let them learn. They can argue and talk all day, but we got sources and we got history. We got genealogy, you know, primary stuff here. Okay? Definition number 2 of swarthy. All right? Pay attention, everybody out there. Pay attention. Active listening is very important with this kind of stuff. That's why you're here, right? Because you want to know things about history, correct stuff. We're not here just to philosophize and blog, right? I'm not here just to blog and give my opinions, right? Definition number 2, black. That's what swarthy means. Definition number 2, black. Definition number 2, black. As the swarthy African, just like an African, not just talking about tans. Yeah, you might apply swarthy. Dark, because it means dark. You can use dark in many ways, right? So we're talking about dark complexion. Yeah, you can use swarthy. Some people that might have a tan. But in general, we're talking about also so-called black people. Now, definition number 2 is swarthy. 1828 Webster's Dictionary means black. Swarthy means black. The swarthy African. All right? So-called black. We clear? We clear with that? Before we get into the primary sources that are describing these people with these words, don't forget, it means black, so-called black. You see it? I highlighted it. Do you see? Don't pretend you're blind. Online Etymology Dictionary, swarthy, dark-colored, especially of skin, 1580s. Unexplained alteration of swarthy, 1570s, from swart, right? Swart, black, dark of night, clouds, figurative, wicked. All right, also could be figurative, but when it comes to physically, complexion, we're talking about dark, wicked, swarta, Old Saxon, Middle Swart, Dutch Swart, dark colored, black, Gothic Swart, dark colored, black, Swordo, dirty, dark, black,
dirty, dark, black, black. The true Germanic word. Surviving in the continental language, but displaced in English by black, so-called black, so-called black, of skin color, of persons from late 14th century. All right? We're going to go back again. We're just going over information we've gone over before. All right? History of the conquest of Spain by the Moors, with a sketch of the civilization which they achieved and imparted to Europe, by Henry Copey in 2 volumes, volume 2, 1892. And we go to page 445. And again, it breaks down Christopher Columbus' name, the Christ bearer, right? That's not his name. What's his name? Salvador Fernandez Sarco. And it's talking about how he brought evil to the Aborigines and that he only thought Moorish civilization was good. All right. And that he left from a Moorish port. All right. And that many of his sailors were Moorish blood in their veins. It has been asserted that when the Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in south of France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became Huguenots. Huguenot. And that of these many emigrated at a later date to South Carolina. Charlestown, a city of free people of color, right? Huguenots are who? Moors, Moorish. Again, Huguenots, right? We're going over information here. Let's not forget that. This is very important for today's lesson. All right, we got Swarthy. What are the 2 key words today? Swarthy, which is black. It's like saying so-called Negro, so-called black. And then we got Huguenots, again, or Moors. All right, Huguenots, Moors. All right. So whenever you hear Huguenot, whenever today I'm reading Huguenot, you think Moors, because that's what they were, Moors. This book here, again, is Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. Again, we're just going over information just to get a clear understanding of what we're going to learn today. It says the largest emigration of all occurred with the so-called Huguenots, who, as we shall see, were in many cases 2nd or 3rd generation Spanish and Portuguese Jews, all right? Correlating with this book, talking about Moors ending up in France becoming known as Huguenots, right? Moors were coming from there, Spain and Portugal, right? They had been expelled. They had been expelled by the Catholics, 1492, and then 1493 and 94 in Portugal, all right? So what were they? They were 3rd or 2nd generation Spanish. That's what Huguenots were. Spanish and Portuguese Jews, who we know from past videos were very swarthy, very dark complexion. The Jews of Portugal and Spain were considered, general consensus at the time, primary sources letting us know Portuguese Jews, Spanish Jews were very dark complexion. People, swarthy. All right. And so again, Huguenots are these people. Basically, again, when we think Huguenot, Moors, right? From Spain and Portugal. I'm not making this up. Don't blame me. It says they were 3rd generation Spanish and Portuguese who traded their French colors for English. So they became known as English, right? They're chameleons. They're like chameleons. They assimilate. That's how they survive. They're the original refugees. They're the original refugees. The word refugee was first applied to Huguenots of Europe, who are actually Moors. Ding, ding, ding. Magic word of the day. Let that bell ring in your head. Swarthy and Huguenots. All right. But what did they do? They traded their so-called French colors for English, Flemish, or some other nationality as they feared religious persecution. They adapted, they amalgamated. They're like chameleons. Check out my Huguenots video. Another example here in the same book. It says, although the bulk of the refugees fled to North Africa and Ottoman or Turkish lands, they're talking about after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal. Thousands of others sought safety in France. Thousands went to France, right? Remember? And the Low Countries. As Protestantism swept across Western Europe, many of these Jewish conversos and moriscos became often only outwardly Protestant. Again, these conversos, meaning they converted to Christianity by force. That's why they call conversos. And moriscos are basically Muslims who converted into Christianity. That is a Morisco. We got the drop on that many times already. All right. So Jewish conversos and Moriscos became often only outwardly Protestant. And this is what I was trying to tell you. What is a Protestant? When you see that word, again, another keyword of the day. All right. We got 3 keywords of the day. We know these words already. We've come across these words already. So we got Swarthy, Huguenots, and Protestants, right? Protestants. It all goes together. Trust me. It all goes together. All right. Again, if you don't know, when we say Jews and we're talking about Sephardic Jews, when we're talking about specifically the Jews, so-called Jews of Spain and Portugal. All right. So in the ranks of dissenters, some even provided leaders for the Huguenots. All right. Who? Jews that didn't go to Africa, right? And stayed in Europe and went to other European countries and actually provided leaders for the Huguenots, the Hussites, the Anabaptists, all right, the Calvinists, John Calvin, the Reformed Church. We already know the Huguenots were followers of the Calvinist Reformed teachings. John Calvin actually goes back to Cohen. He's a Sephardic Jew too, crypto Jew. We got this in previous videos, all right, in this same series. German Reformed, Walloons, Mennonites, all right, all these people of color, all these are started by people of color. Mennonites, Dunkers, Quakers, Puritans, and Presbyterians. All right, when they tired, who really founded these so-called sects, religious Christian sects, right? Puritans and Presbyterians and all that. When the British, Dutch, and French began establishing colonies on the Atlantic, sent as colonists, not subjects of high political and social rank from their respective countries, but for the most part recently arrived patiently anti-Catholic, newly minted Protestants. That's what they were colonizing the people. You got to understand, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. On one hand, they want to get rid of their unwanted, all the Protestants, so-called Protestants, right? Sephardic Jews and more, the Muslims that they got there because they're not Catholics. They want to get rid of them. They want to get rid of all their undesirables, all the poor, all that. Most of them were these people. And so they also needed to colonize America and send people over there and provide free labor through their indentures, right? And so they killed 2 birds with 1 stone. They'd rather send these people. That's who was really coming over here first. We're talking about people of color, Sephardic Jewish. We're talking about religious persecution because of the Catholics, not because of white people, but the Catholic Empire. More and more war, yeah. And then you come over here and you do more and more war, more and more war. Get it? Many were debtors, prisoners, or servants, castles of society who were struggling to get onto their own feet in a new country. Who was a Huguenot, French Huguenot privateers? Drake, a Moorish, right? Huguenot. Word of the day, remember, ding, ding, ding. French Moor, a French Moor privateer. Who? Crypto Jew. Crypto Jews have a study of the antecedents of Huguenots among these of the Spanish legend can be believed. They succeeded in capturing Spanish treasures caravan totaling 300 tons. They were the pirates. We got the drop, Francis Drake, right? Dodged the hijack with the White Watch, and we got an actual, more real depiction. All right, let's back up a little bit. Here we go. Francis Drake. Yeah, Huguenot. Troy Johnson, much love and respect to Troy Johnson. Copyrighted and painted and owned by Troy Johnson. Don't even try it. He's changed the world with his paintings. All right. He's grabbing the actual descriptions of these people, how they're actually described. Like Francis Drake, Swarthy, right? Dark complexion. You know, that's how he's described, not like how he looks here. The Hawkins family, supposed to be slavers, right? Haven for both Sephardic memories of French ports with which they family traded, Dieppe, Rouen, and La Rochelle. La Rochelle is very important in today's lesson because a lot of the Acadians were actually coming from La Rochelle. The first founders of Acadia, first people they were sending were from La Rochelle, Maine, a lot of them, which was a Huguenot town, Moorish town, Huguenot town. Were also heavily populated by Protestant Huguenots, okay? La Rochelle, heavily populated populated by Protestant Huguenots, many of whose origins were Sephardic and Morisco. Sephardic and Morisco. Refresh everybody again. La Rochelle. Just remember what La Rochelle was with the Acadians. A lot of them came from. La Rochelle was a heavy populated Huguenot town. Sephardic Morisco, Moriscos town. All right. 1620, the Virginia Company had another new governor, Francis Wyatt, which is an Arabic surname, Wyatt. All right. The Virginia governor, Francis Wyatt, is Arabic. All right. Muslim. Did you know that? Muslim. Did you know that? 1620, Virginia colony. Are we supposed to imagine these old pale-skinned English people now? Huguenot, most likely. All right. So again, we're just going a little refresh here. Huguenots were descendants of Muslims in Europe. Hey, I'm not the one saying this. I found this on a website. Huguenot history descriptions made in Europe and their occupations, etc., are so integrally related to Muslims that it is not far-fetched to investigate their being Muslims. Remember, it is well known that well before the fall of Muslim Emirate and Wilayats of Sicily and Spain, Muslims had to use two names, where one is to hide their Muslim origin when passing through doing business with people in enemy areas. Such as investigation becomes more of a possibility when we know that Muslims in Spain and other parts of Europe are known in many denominations: Moors, Moriscos, religionaires, Mudijars, crypto-Muslims, conversos, and many may also be Huguenots as well. All right. 1492, Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, was taken by the soldiers of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and the Moors were expelled from Spain. In 1496, to appease Isabella, King Manuel of Portugal announced a royal decree banishing the Moors from the portion of the peninsula. The Spanish King Philip III expelled the remaining Moors by a special decree issued in 1609. Fully 3,500,000 Moors, or Moriscos, as their descendants were called, Moriscos, right? Just like the Huguenots were Moriscos, right? Left Spain between 1492 and 1610. Over 1 million Moriscos made their way to France. 1 million Moriscos made their way to France, where the vast majority of them became what? Huguenot. The vast majority of them became what? Huguenots. It is in France where many of the last descendants of the Almoravids, as well as other Berber groups, settled. It was along with these that our Moorish ancestors made their trek into southern France and were eventually titled by the native Franks as the Saulniers. All right, Saulniers, which today we'll see, I think we're going to get into it, as actually an Acadian family. Was one of the Acadian families that ended up in Louisiana and the other colonies of America. The Saulniers were Huguenot, actually Moors. Yes, that's not a master name. That was your last name. Also spelled Saulnier, Sonny, Sonier, Sonier, and Sonny. From El Murabetum to supposedly dwellers in the Willow, our Moroccan name and history and our Moorish identity is soon forgotten through time. After becoming Huguenots, the family later legitimately made immigration to the Americas. 53 years after the last Moors left Spain, Louis Saulnier was born in Vitre-Betragne, France. Louis later became the first Saulnier to set foot on American soil, arriving where? In Acadia, all right? In Acadia, Nova Scotia, Huguenots in Acadia. Acadian, who's the Acadians? Oh, we're going to get to all that. All right, Nova Scotia and Canada, 1685. Louis was also on the 1693 census taken at Beaubassin. He and his wife, Louis Batenax, also known as Pet Letier, had 13 children. Louis died on the 10th of March in 1709. The family eventually spread all through the United States in areas such as Louisiana, Massachusetts, South Carolina, California. Pierre Saulnier, of the third generation, was deported to Liverpool, England, but later settled in Cayenne, French Guiana. His daughter, Francois, was also exiled to Liverpool, where she married Alan Hebert, while they were both prisoners in that country. And Hebert, or as you guys can see in the word in here, says Ebert. Ebert is a Sephardic Morisco last name. A lot of Acadians also had that last name, and Huguenots. Now it says here, the first Canadian colony, Acadia. There were several expeditions towards Canada. Pierre Chauvin Lord of Tonituit, a Huguenot nobleman from Dieppe. All right, Huguenot. All right, Huguenot, Moor. Key word, right? Ding, 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 Moor. Here shall have been the Moor, the Lord of Tonituit, a Moor nobleman from Dieppe, went to St. Laurent, where he set up first trading posts for selling furs. He had intended to set up a settlement of 500 people in Tadoussac at the mouth of Saguenay, but he died just before setting out on a second expedition. On his first journey, Pierre Dubois de Mons, a Huguenot, another Huguenot Moor nobleman from Royan, was with him, and also Francois Pongave, a rich merchant. The merchants. Who are the merchants? Remember, who's the merchants? Sephardic Jews, mainly Muslim Moors from Saint Malo. In 1603, the king gave Dubois de Mons the authorization to set up a trading post in the peninsula that is to the south of the Gulf of St. Laurent. It used to be called Acadia by the French and is now called Nova Scotia. Dubois de Mons was named lieutenant governor in 1603 by Henry IV and was granted the exclusive rights to deal in furs with the Indians. All right, so I did a past video on how the French were enslaving the Indians. A lot of that was done through the coursier de bois, fur traders, supposedly also slavers. They were slaving people. They were trading people too. All right. The first fur traders, first coursier de bois, who became known as coursier de bois, were actually Huguenots that had landed in Acadia. All right. So that's the whole story behind that. Go check out that video. Great video. The history of the coursier de bois and what they were doing amongst the Indians, not only enslaving, but also mixing. A lot of them didn't enslave, they just mixed in and married indigenous women. We're going to get a lot of that today. We're going to see how these Acadians, these French Huguenots, were heavily mixing in with indigenous women. We got even laws set up for that. We're going to get all that information today. So it says that he laid the foundations of the Port Royal colony. That was the very first place called Port Royal in Acadia, which consisted of many Catholics as there were Protestants. Samuel Champlain, a Huguenot, all right, Champlain, a Huguenot Moor, another Moor, right, who had converted to Catholicism in 1598, went with him. Now, when I said many Catholics were there, a lot of those Catholics were actually, just like Champlain, had converted to Catholicism from so-called being Protestant or Huguenots. But in 1607, Dubois de Mons lost the exclusive right which enabled him to trade with the Indians, and the colony was abandoned by the French. In 1600, a new expedition set out in search of an unknown territory. Led by Champlain, he discovered Quebec and founded the first permanent French settlement in America. All right, so Quebec, another major city there in Canada, was founded by a Moor, yeah, slash AKA Huguenot. Parentheses. Okay, Quebec, yeah. And from 1620 to 1640, this colony was the object of much dispute between the French of Acadia and the English of New England. The English won it initially. Then in 1633, it was returned to the French at the Treaty of Saint Germain and Laye. Later, at the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the French lost it again. So that's an important history here in Acadia, how the people in charge were switching hands all the time. And that would affect the people living in Acadia, who were these French colonists who were actually mixing a lot with the Indians. So they had become their own kind of people, a lot of them. A lot of them didn't mix. They stayed, with their Huguenot wife and Huguenot family, and from there got expelled, right? Along with the other ones. But very important, when the English were in control, depending on who was king in England, like if it was a Protestant king or a Catholic king, and same with France, it would affect them. Again, why? Not because they just didn't like the Acadians, or because English were beefing with France and it was England versus France. No, it was because they were, again, Moorish people, Sephardic Jews, right? Jews and Muslims. They weren't Catholics, and that's why the English, so-called English, who were actually Catholics, expelled them from there. So big thing to overstand right there as we read today. We're going to see that. It says here, business flourished in the area, business contacts between Acadia and La Rochelle. La Rochelle, remember La Rochelle? That was a Huguenot, majorly populated by Huguenots. La Rochelle, France, continued until the revocation of Edict of Nantes. the Huguenots were freely in Saint Laurent Valley, although they were not allowed to practice their religion. And what religion, right? So they, they got a religion. They're Moors and Jews. In spite of pressure from the clergy, the civil authorities did not object to them being in the colony, although they had never been officially allowed to emigrate. Towards 1620, the merchants of Rouen and Saint Malo joined forces with company of merchants run by Guillaume de Cain, right? Cain, a Protestant, as Hebrew or Jewish, right? A Protestant, and Ezekiel, another Hebrew or Jewish name, Cain, right? Of the same family, a Catholic, right? So these are all Sephardic Jews, Moorish Muslims, all right? So talking about this guy here, Relu, who was a Huguenot as well, sent Jesuit missionaries to Acadia. All right, we're just going over the information here. A lot of Jesuit missions there in Canada with the French, especially trying to convert the Indians and all that. A lot of those were working alongside the Huguenots. All right, they had. It says here Pierre du Bois de Mons. All right, we've got him already a little bit. The Calvinist nobleman, right? Calvinist Huguenot nobleman, Huguenot Moorish nobleman, Pierre du Bois de Mons. We already got the drop that he was a Huguenot. Founded Acadia, and with the help of Samuel Champlain, another Huguenot, all right, created the big structure of French colony in Canada. All right, who's creating the basic structure of French colony? Moors, people of color. All right, this is your history too. So here's the conquest of Acadia in 1604. Du Bois de Mons did commercial business with merchants from Rouen, Saint Malo, and La Rochelle. He fitted out 2 ships, the gift of God and the good renown, and led his first expedition with several other noblemen and other Protestants. Samuel Champlain, who was a navigator, cartographer. Like I was trying to tell you, all these navigators, cartographers, the people on the seas, the captains, pirates, a lot of them, again, were Moors. And this is proving it even more, just letting you know who held these titles, who was really the ones, why they were sending these people, because they had the experience. They established a base at St. Croix Island. That's in Acadia. There's actually an island there called St. Croix. And then in Port Royal. But the settlers suffered from scurvy in the icy Canadian winter. In 1605, du Bois left the Port Royal base in the hands of Champlain and Palgrave and returned to France in order to prepare for a new expedition. He was much criticized for his monopoly of the fur trade and his stubborn adherence to the Reformed faith, but he managed to equip a new ship which was later to explore the South American coast, but he never established another French base there. In 1607, Du Bois met with more opposition, largely because of his monopoly of the fur trade. So he was really all about the money, right? He was all about the money. He didn't care about really helping his people or whatever. And they said he didn't want to get rid of his Reformed faith, meaning he didn't want to convert to Catholicism because he was a Moor, all right? British America. It says here by John McGregor Esquire in 2 volumes, volume 2. All right. It says here the Acadians are nearly destitute of education. Scarcely any of the women and few of the men can read or write. And like all ignorant people, it matters not of what religion they are, exceedingly bigoted and superstitious. Now, what we're reading here, I think I went a little ahead. This is when they were going through their exile. All right, and they had been removed from their hand, but a lot of times it didn't mean that people were like what you would say stupid or unintelligent because they can't read or write. A lot of times it was just farming the whole time. They had money, they were merchants, they knew how to do things, they got things done and made money. They didn't have to read or write a lot of the times. So so we got to look at that a little differently. All right, now it says here the descendants of the French settled in north side of Bay de Charlier are mostly Acadians, but from their intimate intercourse. Now remember, before I continue, they like to say that slaves didn't know how to read or write, right? That's a big one right there. I just wanted to mention that, all right? Why is that important, Kurimeo? Well, we'll see. So they couldn't read or write, right, Acadians. So now let's just say, one of these Huguenot Swarthy Acadians, right, somehow got into some indenture, right? And then he gets on a census as a slave, and they ask, can he read or write? No. So the whole time you're thinking this is African, who never learned how to read, poor, oh, he didn't ever talk. These people, I believe they had the opportunity. I don't think they needed it where they were at, amongst themselves there. But who knows? The real story. We're going to see what they went through. It says here, the descendants of the French settled in the north side of the bay, the Chaleur, are mostly Acadians. But from their intimate intercourse with Quebec, and the Canadians are more intelligent people than the other Acadians, whom they, as well as the Canadians, denominate les savages. All right? So they call them savage, right? Why they call them the Acadian savages? This appellation is owing to some of the Acadians. So some of them are considered savage. Some of them are more, I guess, true blood, right? Some of the Acadians, right? There's a caste system here, is what they're talking about. This appellation owing to some of the Acadians having in consequence of their ancestors marrying Indian women. Acadians, right? Who's the Acadians? Huguenots, Moors. Moors marrying Indian women, the indication of Mi'kmaq blood, apparent in their countenance. The Acadians have swarthy complexions. All right? The Acadians have what? Swarthy complexions. Kurimeo. What you talking about? Swarthy. What does swarthy mean, Kurimeo? Black. Black complexion. The Acadians have black, swarthy, dark, swarthy, black. Moors are black, are swarthy, right? Dark skinned, swarthy. All right, let's go back. The Acadians have swarthy complexions and seldom fair hair, are generally well made, but the men are very rarely inclined to corpulency. The women are usually under the middle stature, with thick waists and ungainly figures. The features of their faces are, however, generally regular, with fine eyes and expressive countenances. All right, this is from the Library and Archives of Canada. Again, some general information. What does mainstream tell us about Acadians? Mainstream, right? The term Acadian refers to immigrants from France in the early 1600s who settled in the colony of Acadia, in what are now the provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Right? Very simple, right? The colonization of Acadia by the French started in 1604 at Port Royal in the 1630s. About 20 families came from the Louisiana area, and soon after, soldiers and Gagis joined them. In 1670, the Acadian population consisted of 400 people. Steadily, the population grew and the territory expanded to include Nova Scotia, Cape Breton Island, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. With the signing of the Treaty of Ulrich in 1713, Acadia was given away to Great Britain, right? Given away, with the exception of the St. Jean, Prince Edward Island, and Isla Royale, Cape Breton Island. As early as 1754, due to the threat of new war in America, Charles Lawrence, governor of Nova Scotia, was considering the deportation of the Acadians. All right, deportation between 1755 and 1762. About 10,000 Acadians were made prisoners and were deported to American colonies, Great Britain and France. And where were they deported? So they won't tell us in history that these people ended up in plantations, right? As slaves. A lot of them going through a lot of torture and a lot of stuff in the ships and being stuck in the ports for like months, not being allowed to come in. And we're gonna read a lot of these people were escaping, right? What were they escaping? They never tell you that they actually land in plantations. But were they escaping then, right? And where were they heading? If they were from Acadia, where you think they were heading? All these swarthy, so-called black people from Acadia escaping to once they were free. All right? Why don't you think about that for a while until we get to it? By 1764, the Acadians were allowed to return on condition of dispersing themselves over the territory and swearing their loyalty to the British Crown. Many Acadians returned to America as laborers for the merchant fishermen of Jersey Island. Many Acadians from France and the American colonies settled in Louisiana. Those returning to maritime chose to settle in Baie Sainte Marie in western Nova Scotia, Shetty Camp on the western shore of Cape Breton Island, the Malpaga region of Prince Edward Island, and on the eastern and northern shores of New Brunswick, as well as in the province of Quebec, particularly in the area of Yamachiche and La Acadie. All right, some more general history here. Yes, we're in Wikipedia. Yes, of course, I know. Acadians, again, mainstream. What are they telling us, right? These are very simple explanations. The Acadians are descendants of French who settled in Acadia. Again, once again, some in certain areas are also descended from the indigenous peoples of the region. Oh, that's the sign there. You see, some are what? Descended from the indigenous peoples of that region. Some of the Acadians, they're not all just French, right? They're not just French. They're not just French, right? It says, though most Acadians remained neutral during the war, the British, together with New England legislators and militia, carried out the expulsion of the Acadians between 1755 and 1764. They forcefully deported approximately 11,500 Acadians from the maritime region. Approximately one-third perished from disease and drowning. You hear what's going on? Listen, man, this is very important. They perished from, all right, so when we got these Kunta Kinte stories and all these people dying on sea and getting thrown over, there's real history of people actually going through that, because there is no African slave ships right now. But there's actual ships with people dying coming from different parts of Europe, actually North America. You see even Caribbean, South America. Most Acadians were deported to various British American colonies. All right, where were they sent? Where many were put into forced labor or servitude. All right, there's actual sources for that. Were put into plantations. Acadians, did they ever tell you? So if Acadians are so-called pale-skinned people or white people, right? French white people, they never told us there was white French people in the plantations with so-called African slaves working together and escaping and trying to head north to Canada. Oh yeah, it's getting deep. Some Acadians were deported to England, some to the Caribbean, and some to France. After being expelled to France, many Acadians were eventually recruited by the Spanish government to migrate to Louisiana. All right, the Spaniards sending people, getting land grants in Louisiana, giving it to who? French? Isn't that a theme? Isn't that like a common theme around this time in that area? Right, Spanish giving land away to French, Swarthy French, so-called Black French, who are coming and creating their towns and mixing in with indigenous people of the area, creating a whole answer, a whole genealogy. Their descendants gradually developed what became known as Cajun culture. Who's the Cajuns? Who's the real Cajuns? Cajun culture. During the 17th century, about 60 French families were established in Acadia. They developed friendly relations with the peoples of the Wabanaki Confederacy, particularly the regional Mi'kmaq, learning their hunting and fishing techniques developed for local conditions. The Camus or Camus family history. Camus. Do some of you have Camus from Louisiana in you? We're gonna get to that today. Who's the Camus? Camus. The Huguenots and New France and Acadia. Who? The Moors, right? Keyword of the day. Ding, 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 ding. Huguenot Moors. The Moors and New France and Acadia. It is little known fact that the Huguenots were also present in French colonies. The first attempt at colonizing Acadia was in 1603 by the Pontgrave and Sir Desmond, both Huguenots, both what? Moors, Moorish people. Yes. Later joined by Champlain, another Moor. Their attempt failed due to poor organization. They tried again around 1605, bringing about 20 men, soldiers and artisans, both Catholics and Protestants, but little came of it. Mr. de Racilly was the one who finally established a permanent settlement at Port Royal. In 1636, the first families landed in Acadia, having traveled aboard St. Jehan, the Acadian equivalent of the Mayflower. That was their Mayflower. These adventurers needed the permission and protection of the king, as well as financing from French merchants. Who's these merchants? These are Sephardic Jews and the Muslim Moors with the money. They were the ones loaning the money and finance and everything. They made a lot of money out of it. Yeah, they were the money handlers, yep. Remember the Port Jews? Remember? The network, the Protestant, the Port Jews? Yeah, the Dutch trade. It's all the same people. Huguenot merchants were well represented in that group, all right? Especially Huguenot merchants. The home ports of these merchants were St. Malo and Rowan, with an addition to La Rochelle later. Of the pioneers, original pioneers, Jean Pitre, all right? Pitre. All right, so Jean Pitre and Isaac Pesley, among others, were Huguenots. And to this today, business had no religion, all right? Again, business had no religion. It ain't about religion. It's really all about business. At the down of it, it's all about business. They didn't really, they didn't really care that the Huguenots or the Moors were Muslims or Jews. What the Catholics cared about was the business they had monopoly over. That's what they cared about. Let's not pretend that these people are actual religious, like actual followers of the Most High. It's all business. Religion kind of becomes business. Get it? As long as the Protestant merchants kept themselves to business affairs, everything was fine. However, if they wanted to marry into the population, the young men had to renounce their religion, something I give up easily. For example, a Scottish Huguenot, a what? A Scottish ding 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 Moor. The Huguenot merchants used their influence to send some ministers of their faith along with Catholic missionaries. This mixture of faith brought some interesting results. Here is Champlain on the subject. I have seen the minister on cure and fist fights, trying to solve their religious differences. The minister often complaining to Sir Desmonts that he was being harassed by the priest. His last words on the subject: they send here a doubting priest and minister, and they expect them to convert all the Indians. So that's deep right there. So they're trying to both convert, all these Europeans are trying to convert the Indians to Catholicism, right? When they're not even in sync with their religious beliefs. That's what they're letting you know here. They had arguments. Of course, this is a more Muslim debating a priest, a Catholic priest. So we say Protestant, right, or Huguenot, but it's really a Muslim, right? Sephardic Jew going at it with a Catholic priest. So that's why. Acadians had a few posts halfway down the coast of Maine, making them next door neighbors to New England, a cause of much friction. From its foundation to the final rendition, Acadia changed hands more often than Alsace-Lorraine. Again, I mentioned that earlier, how it was kept changing hands, people in charge, which affected the people there locally. There was an element of piracy. All right, pirates. Who's the pirates? Corsairs or privateers, right? AKA privateers. Pirates sounds so much better, right? Privateers, right? Sounds so much better on both sides. One day they were raiding each other, posting ships, and the next they were trading. So one day they're beefing, the next they're doing business. In spite of France's objection, the merchants as far away as Quebec found this trade more profitable, as they did not have to cross the Atlantic. An Acadian merchant and pioneer, Louis Champlain, being bilingual and a landowner in Wells, Maine, purchased a boat, the Endeavor. He used it to sail up down the coast, probably becoming the first North American mail boat. You see that? It says Quebec and Montreal also had their share of Huguenots or Moors. With the passing of time and marriages, their children were assimilated by the Catholic population. They converted Moriscos. The more hardy stayed single or moved to other areas, but some certainly came back after the British conquest. Canadian Migrations, reading Canada 19th Century American Literature by Elisa Erin McLean, BA in McGill University 2001 and MA University of Western Ontario. A thesis submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Faculty of Graduate Studies, the University of British Columbia. It says here, this chapter contributes to contemporary critical discussions about mid-19th century North American literary relations by examining how literary representations of Acadia shaped popular American discussions about the meaning of American national identity. All right, identity. What's your real identity? From roughly the 1830s to 1850s, the interests of American authors began to converge on the traumatic displacement of the Acadians. All right, the traumatic. They went through a real traumatic event, a diaspora. A group of French Catholic settlers in the British colony of Nova Scotia who were forced from their homes by Anglo-American militias in 1755. In an effort to minimize a perceived French threat to British North America, at the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, Anglo-American militias deported an estimated 7,000 to 12,000 Acadians. See how the numbers keep growing? To different Anglo-American colonies. Colonies, all right? 12,000? That's a lot of people. Being sent to plantations, to work in plantations. I thought it was all Negroes. I thought it was all Africans. 80 years after this event called the Grand Derangement by most Canadian historians and scholars, New England literary elites, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, all right, this is a poets and stuff and writers. There's a famous poem, the Acadian, the exile of somebody, this girl, um, which she describes the Indians as Swarthy in that poem. Look it up. Nathaniel Hawthorne, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Harriet Beecher Stowe began representing the event in their verse, children's books, sentimental fiction, and histories of North America. Edward Richard Acadia, Missing Links of a Lost Chapter in American History, by an Acadian, ex-member of the House of Commons of Canada. Chapter 29 says, we are alas on the eve of witnessing the fulfillment of Lawrence's doubly criminal project, the deportation of an entire people, finally snatched from their homes, right? Okay, now we're going to go into Kunta Kinte fairy tales right now. Remember what they told us about so-called African slave trade? They were snatching, finally, right? Entire peoples, right? And deporting them, right? To the colonies, right? All right. None of that has been proven yet, but we have real primary sources, real history telling us of a Swarthy people, Moorish people, being finally snatched from their homes, from that smiling and fertile land which their fathers had discovered and colonized over a century before. In a burst of colonizing zeal, France had left upon those shores some dozens of families, whom she afterwards with guilty carelessness forgot. They just left them there. France didn't even help them. Again, because France, a lot of the times, were being ran by Catholics. So it wasn't a France country versus England thing. This is what you need to understand. This is what they leave out of the history that they probably don't understand, the teachers or professors, or purposely leaving it out in their secret societies talking about it, But this is very important to understand. And again, it even doesn't really boil down to religion, which they try to use the excuse, it's all business, right? Who has the ports? Who has the trade? Who knows all these skills? It's all business. At the period we have now reached, the memory of the French fatherland had long become faint and distinct. Tradition alone could recall both France and the history of those who were the pioneers of the country. Those original families had increased and multiplied. They're talking about the original Huguenots who arrived in Acadia. They had increased and multiplied. Moors, the 200 who founded the colony, had grown to 17,000 souls. 17,000 what? Descendants of Moorish and Indian indigenous people. All right? A small nation with habits, tastes, and traditions of their own. They became their own people. That's why Acadians are referred to Acadians and not just French. They're special French, right? They're Acadians. They were all members of one large family, bound together by ties of blood or by common memories. Again, that's a common tradition amongst Huguenots, Sephardic Jews, Muslims, in the family, marrying into each other's sisters, cousins. If a man's wife died, his brother would take her on. As a Jewish Muslim custom, people would just keep it in the family again for business as well. Their home was no longer France. It was there in Acadia, all in all before their eyes, in the country that stretched as far as they could see, in silent nature, or in the works which they or their fathers had laboriously accomplished. By little and little, the accumulated dress to the inhabitants. It was translated into French by a man called Beauchamp, a merchant at Piggygood. So what I wanted to read to you guys here is, this is one case where they told all the men, right, young men and adult men, to go to the town church or hall because they had a special speech to give them from the English ministers, right, appointed local governors, right? And this is what they told them, like straight out of nowhere. This was out of nowhere, even though they had their suspicion that they were thinking about maybe deporting them. So it's here. It reads as follows: to the inhabitants of the district where Grand Prix mines, River Carnard, and places adjacent, as well as ancients as young men and lads. Whereas His Excellency the Governor has instructed us of his late resolution respecting the matter proposed to the inhabitants, and has ordered us to communicate the same in person. His Excellency being desirous that each of them should be satisfied of His Majesty's intentions, which he has ordered us to communicate to you, as they have been given to him. We therefore order, and strictly by these presents of all the inhabitants as well of the above named district, as of all other districts, both old and young men, as well as the lads of 10 years of age, to attend the church Grand Prix on Friday the 5th instance at 3 of the clock in the afternoon, that we may impart to them what we are ordered to communicate to them, declaring that no excuse will be admitted on any pretense whatsoever on pain of forfeiting goods and chattels in default of real estate. So basically, they threatened them, if you guys don't show up, it's a mandatory meeting. All the townsmen have to go. You might get your things taken away, your goods and your property, your real estate. So it says here, gentlemen, I have received from His Excellency Governor Lawrence the King's instructions, which I have in my hand. It says here, by his orders, you are called together to hear His Majesty's final resolution concerning the French inhabitants of this province of Nova Scotia, who for more than half a century have more indulgence granted them than any of his subjects in any part of the dominions. What use you have made of it, yourselves best know. So he's saying that we let you guys stay here kind of too long. We kind of gave you too much comfort. We didn't, that's what they're saying. We granted you too many privileges, too many indulgence, more indulgence granted them, than any other people in any other parts of their colonies. The duty I'm now upon, though necessary, is very disagreeable to my natural make and temper, as I know it must be grievous to you, who are of the same species. But it is not my business to advert on the orders I have received, but to obey them. And therefore, without hesitation, I shall deliver to you His Majesty's instructions and commands, which are that your lands, I listen to what they got to do. All your lands and your tenements and your cattle and livestock of all kinds are forfeited to the crown, with all your other effects except money and household goods, and that you yourselves are to be removed from this his province. All right, they just straight up told them. They put them in the meeting there and told them, you guys, hey, guess what? We're gonna take all your cattle, you're gonna keep your money and all that, but you're gonna be removed. You're out of here. That's what they told them. The peremptory orders of His Majesty are that all of the French inhabitants of these districts be removed, and through His Majesty's goodness, I am directed to allow your money and as many of your household goods as you can take without overloading the vessels you go in. All right. I shall do everything in my power that all these goods be secured to you, and that you be not molested in carrying them away, and also that whole family shall go in the same vessel, so that this removal, which I am sensible must give you a great deal of trouble, may be made as easy as His Majesty's services will admit. And I hope that in whatever part of the world your lot may fall, wherever you end up going, even if it's a plantation, sugar plantation or something, you may be faithful subjects and peaceable and happy people. The end. It's crazy, right? Really crazy. Story of the Acadians, the Camus. The story of the Acadians is a fascinating one. It has another unusual facet. No major literary work on Cajun history has been published. I have gathered information from several publications about the Cajuns and will present a short version of Cajun history. The Acadians were mostly French colonists who came to Acadia, now known as Nova Scotia, probably as early as 1604. All right, Huguenots, Moors, that's what they were. The records reveal that Louis Herbert Eber, Sephardic Jew, the ancestor of the large number of Eberts now living in Louisiana, arrived at Fort Royal in Nova Scotia on July 27, 1606. He was a son of Drugis to Catherine of Medici, Queen of France. Pierre Camus, all right, Pierre Camus, the ancestor of most of the Camus in Acadiana, all right, was born in France in 1597. He was a copper by trade and married Marie Bayol in 1641. A census taken in Nova Scotia in 1671 revealed families of Bertrand, Blanchard, all right, look at these names: Bourg, Brout, Brooks, Camus, Cormier, Dupuy, Doucet, Gerard, Herbert, Landry, LeBlanc, Richard, Robichaud, Theroux, Theria, Trahan. All right, we're going to get to the Trahans too. Thibaudeau and Vincent. The Bourg, Brout, Cormier, Dupuy, Girard, Herbert, Landry, LeBlanc, Robichaud, and Thibaudeau families came from around Vienne and southeast France. Later in 1686 and 1710, we find families with the names of Dubois, right? W.B. Du Bois. Remember, he was a Huguenot. Dubois, Herpin, Leger, Maximum, Mutin, Seaman, Bottom, Primeau, Duhon, Picard, Judry, and Nova Scotia. Again, Dubois. Why were they Acadians? Of course, because they were Huguenots. We already knew that, right? We got the Du Bois genealogy video we did. These people farmed, trapped, raised livestock, and did all the usual things associated with colonization of the New World. In spite of the hardships of colonization, they grew and prospered. But storm clouds were on the horizon for our ancestors. The clouds gathered as the bitter rivalry between English and the French came to boiling point. This rivalry was rooted in the desire of a nation to establish a complete trade monopoly in the New World. Again, it was all about business. Who had the monopoly? It was the Moors. It was the Sephardic Jews. The result of the rivalry was a series of wars between England and France, known collectively as the Commercial Wars. Commercial business wars. The first was King William's War, 1689-97, followed by the War of Spanish Succession, 1702-13, and the final struggle beginning in 1754, and known in American history as the French and Indian War. That was a what? A business war. The French and Indian War was a commercial war. Since England's colonies, New England and French colonies in Canada, Acadia, and Nova Scotia bordered each other, they became involved in these conflicts, which were deepened by great differences in language, customs, and religion. Thus, the stage was set for the unique tragedy of the expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. The expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia, Acadia by the British followed these series of wars between the British and French, in which the British were the victors and the spoils of war took possession of Nova Scotia. It is significant to know that during the French and English War, the Acadians, who were ultimately to suffer tragically as a result of the wars, remained more or less neutral throughout. All right, even at this time, they weren't war-like people. They had been established as farmers. They were gentle, peaceful people living amongst the Indians, and even at this time, they were neutral. They became known as French neutrals when they got expelled. Wherever they were sent, they got known as French neutrals. During the wars, the Acadians found their homeland a battlefield between the two warring powers, and they were victims of numerous raids by both sides. They saw their houses burned, livestock slaughtered, and crops laid to waste. Peace came in April 1713, and by the Treaty of Utrecht, King Louis the 14th, the magnificent Soi Rolé, the Sun King, all right, meaning Sun King, all right. Why was he called the Sun King? The Sun King, right? Sacrificed Acadia to the British. Under the Treaty of the Acadians, they were granted the option to remaining on their land and religious freedom or leaving Acadia and forfeiting their lands. Since there was really little choice, the Acadians stayed on, but for the next 40 years, their times were trying. Soon after the Treaty, the British, who wanted the fertile Acadian land for their own settlers, began a series of persecutions of the Acadians, striking at national origin and their religion. What is that religion? Again, a lot of these were Muslims. A lot of these were Sephardic Jews, cryptos. Some sought to leave, but learned that for the most part, the option had been revoked and they were prohibited from leaving. Part of the persecutions was an insistence by the British that the Acadians take an unqualified oath of allegiance to the British crown, since this could involve infringement upon their practice of their religion and bearing arms against their fellow countrymen from France. The Acadians refused. After this refusal, the British began to plan the ultimate expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. In the ensuing years, the Acadians proved their loyalty to England by refusing to join the rebellious act against the crown. This, however, was not enough, and the Acadians continued to live in suspense as to their future. Finally, 1755, the expulsion was effected under the order of Lawrence Lieutenant, Governor of Acadia, on September 5th, 1755. At the Acadian settlement of Grand Pré, all the Acadian men and boys over 18 years of age were assembled at the church. They numbered 411. This is what I was just talking about, how they assembled all the men and children, men and adult men, the young men, little boys. There, Colonel Winslow told them that their lands and livestock were forfeited to the crown and that they were to be driven out of Acadia. Some of them never saw their wives and families after this assembly. So they made them a lot of promises that they didn't keep. They actually did separate families. These people got treated really bad. They went through really traumatic things. Again, they got called in for a meeting, and all of a sudden, you're never going to see your wife, your kids, your mom or dad. I mean, at least your mom and wife, your daughters, ever again. All right, can you imagine that? Now, A lot of this makes me think of the movie 12 Years a Slave. And there's a very significance in that movie too. All right. Even though they throw a lot of hijack, it's a little bit of truth there, but they're telling it with the false narratives, right? But this really happened. People were really getting snatched up and they had to escape and go back. They had to gain their freedom and go back after 12 years. So it's funny, right? But whatever. So 20 of their numbers released. Okay, so it says 20 of their number were released the next day to visit the families of the 411 and tell them sad news. After several days, they were paraded to the harbor where they were loaded to 5 ships and expelled. And again, among the families in those first 411 were 27 Boudreaux or Burdukes, 12 Comos or Comooks, 2 Benoits, 2 Blanchards, 2 Brooks, 1 David, 2 Dawsets, 1 Duan or Duhan, Saunier, Sonnier, Terrier, Thibaut Dukes, 16 Trahans. All right, so those were the numbers, 56 LeBlancs, 2 Vincents. One of their numbers was Louis Arsenault, who was to achieve immortality as a Gabriel to Longfellow's Evangeline. You see that? But he didn't go through the Mississippi, so that was kind of made up, that part. Click here for the details on the arsenal. Okay, so it says the first expulsion preceded many of the others over a span of a decade, at the end of which most of the Acadians in Nova Scotia had been placed on other ships bound for New England to join the original 411. Some of the Acadians evaded capture, armed themselves, and became guerrillas in the woods of Nova Scotia. All right? Maroon behavior, right? Same thing Maroons did, right? But for the great book of the Acadians, their homeless wanderings had begun and was not to end until many years later. All right? A lot of them actually lived in the woods for many, many years doing that. And they lived like that the rest of their lives. When they established a new Acadia in Southwest Louisiana, until they established New Acadia in Southwest Louisiana, they're like, all right, I'm going down south. We're talking about Swarthy, Acadians, Moorish people, some of them mixed with Indians. The expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia by the British was neither easy nor complete. Many of the Acadians, after British trickery, resulted in the quick deportation of the first 411 Acadians. Many fled to the woods and took up resistance against expulsion. Many fled to the woods. The British Crown placed prices on the head of the renegade Acadians, and the British Army roamed throughout Acadia, Nova Scotia, for over 7 years, searching out these who had escaped deportation. You understand? Even 7 years later, they're still looking for you. They didn't just let you go. They're like, lah. When I say you, I mean if you have Huguenot ancestors, any of these people are Acadian, then that's why I'm saying you. John Brossard, all right, Brossard, nicknamed Beausoleil, meaning pretty son, was one of the Acadians who escaped deportation by fleeing to the woods. The Broussards are very important. I also got that name in the person's genealogy. There he became chief of a minor resistance force of Acadians who waged guerrilla warfare against the British. The British were unable to capture this clever Cajun and his band. So it's funny how, he has like a name, Pretty Son. He might be half Indian. He's going in the woods, guerrilla style warfare. He's he became a chief of a minor Acadian resistance. What does that all mean, right? After the defeat of Montcalm in Quebec, Beausoleil realized that the French cause in Canada was dead and that further resistance would be futile. He and his band surrendered to the British at Fort Cumberland. On November 16, 1759, they were held as prisoners of war until peace, 1763. By his release, Broussard went to the island of Santo Domingo and then worked his way to Louisiana, all right? Santo Domingo, right? Hispaniola, where he was commissioned as a captain in the militia of St. Martinville. He is the ancestor of many of the Broussards who now populate Southwest Louisiana. We're going to get one of those today. And a lot of those are so-called black people today. And they didn't, again, that is not a slave name. All right? Again, that is not a slave name. I mean, a slave master name, right? In Pennsylvania, the Acadians were kept on board ships. Listen to this. In Pennsylvania, the Acadians were kept on board ships for 2 months. How do you keep people on a ship for 2 months? In Georgia, they were permitted to land, but were banished. Most of them made their way into the hostile interior. Our ancestors were severely mistreated in Massachusetts and the Carolinas. Everywhere in the New World the Acadians went, they were mistreated. Except in, says our ancestors, except in Maryland. Maryland was the only state to afford the wanderers a welcome, due probably to the fact that the state had a large Catholic population. No. One of the Acadians who found solace in Maryland was Emmeline Labiche, who later made her way to St. Martinville and achieved Cajun fame as the model for Longfellow's Evangeline. Most of the dispersed Acadians did not remain in English colonies where they were unwanted. They weren't even wanted there. They were dumping them there, so of course they were being treated bad because they didn't even want them there. And again, they're not going to live for free off somebody, so they were probably being forced to work, right? Many made their way back to Canada and Nova Scotia or to Louisiana. So, okay, again, so if they're in the Carolinas, right? They're in Georgia, they're in Pennsylvania, and they have to go all the way back to Nova Scotia. Don't they have to travel north, just like people in the Underground Railroad? Where is the Underground Railroad going? To Canada, right? That was the story. Or we already know the Dutch the hijack with Harriet Tubman and all that slavery stuff. Now we're trying to understand who might have actually been doing that and where was the true model of the Underground Railroad really. It was about Acadians, actually. Acadians heading back home, north. They were heading back home, north, escaping. A lot of them probably met people on the way, other people, other indentured servants, whether they were Black Europeans or Indians, and say, hey, we know a place you can probably go with us up north. And they, so again, a lot of them were Indians. You can't hold an Indian with too rebellious, right? A lot of them were half Indian through the Mi'kmaq Metis connection they had. All right, so they were heading back to Canada, Nova Scotia, or to Louisiana. Some, however, stayed in the English colonies and changed their names, like LeBlanc to White. All right, like LeBlanc to White, anglicized LeBlanc. Why white? Because Blanco, right? Blanco is white. LeBlanc, the white. LeBlanc is like French saying the white. So to white, right? So all of a sudden, you got people who might be doing their genealogy and run into let's say Pierre White, who's all of a sudden English, and you're assuming he's a white person. You never knew he was an Acadian Swarthy person, an Acadian Swarthy person who was named LeBlanc. But I see that a lot once you get past the barrier of the 1800s that they have set up. They have a barrier they purposely set up so you don't get to these historic people, which are a lot of your family ancestors, pioneers and stuff, right? And that's how it happens. You forget the whole history. All right, so Brun to Brown, right? Brun, we know Brun means brown. Brun to Brown. One of Louisiana's most distinguished citizens, Edward Douglas White, who became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, reportedly descended from a family of LeBlancs who had changed their name during the Cajun wanderings. All right. He was a what? Acadian. He was a Huguenot descent. More because they were a pitiful lot, broken-hearted, penniless, spoke of a foreign language, practiced a different religion, and were descendants of people who were natural enemies of England. The Acadians were cruelly received throughout most of the English colonies. It is no wonder that these exiles, as soon as they were able to travel, sought places of refuge where the French flag still flew. That's why they were escaping. And again, they weren't the same people as Catholics, Muslim or Sephardic Jews. Yeah, different religion, right? Some Acadians went to France, and then most of them found their way to Louisiana. Others went to Santo Domingo, Guadeloupe, and Martinique from the English colonies. But because they were poor and could not afford slaves and were unable to withstand the scorching climate, the Acadians eventually decided to head for Louisiana to join their compatriots already there. The first Acadians' arrivals in Louisiana landed in New Orleans in the fall of 1756, a year after their departure from Acadia. They came from Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Some had traveled overland, making use of the many tributaries flowing into the Mississippi River. According to Judge Voorhees, his grandmother was among those who came from Maryland. She had adopted Emmeline Labiche, the Evangeline Longfellow immortal poem. His grandmother also told him that Emmeline became demented when she did not eventually meet Louis in St. Martinville and found out that he had already married someone else. Mercifully, she died shortly thereafter. The bulk of the Acadian population at the time of dispersal stayed in Canada or ended up in Louisiana. They were attracted there because it was French, and the French government guaranteed them food and tools for a year. Oh, that was a very good incentive. The first Acadian colony in Louisiana was established on the Mississippi River, 60 miles north of New Orleans, the site of present day Donaldsonville. Some also settled along the Bayou Lafourche, beginning in 1768. In 1757, the governor of Louisiana opened up the colonization, the vast prairie land of the Atacapas and Opelousas Indian country. They were taking their land and giving it to the Acadians in the southwestern corner of Louisiana. All right? Settlements sprang up along the various bayous, such as the Teche and Vermilion. The Justice des Atacapas, Fort Atacapas, later to become St. Martinville, was one of the first and chief settlements of the area. Acadians began to arrive at Fort Atacapas in 1765. One of the documents which was preserved in a contract dated April 4, 1765, between Antoine Bernard and several other Cajuns, under the terms of which Bernard agreed to furnish the others with cattle to begin vacheries, vacherie, or cattle raising farms. One of the parties to the contract was Joseph Broussard, nicknamed Bill Soleil, about whom we have previously written. Soleil died on October 20th of the same year and was buried near the site of the present-day town of Broussard. All right, the progenitor of the Broussards. The Acadians who arrived there during that period met Canadians and Frenchmen who were already living in this region. Some of them bore the names of Decure, des Hotels, Fontenant, Hollier, Latilevels, Patton, and Stelly. All right, so big one right there. I did a video on the Decor family of Louisiana. They were black slave owners. They were straight up black slave owners. And now I got the link. Because the Decors came from France, not from Acadia, but that's because they had gone to Acadia, France. They had been sent to France directly from Nova Scotia for a while, and they had to be resettled. Remember, the Spanish resettled them from France to Louisiana. The Decors were black people. The Decors, we got the census, we got everything. We showed they were black slave owners. Also, the Montanants, same thing. End up being so-called black families of Louisiana. It says here, Camp des Parents. And I'm just going to read what it says here. Between 1756 and 1758, several dozen Acadians fled to Mariamichi regions, particularly to Wilson's Point, favorably situated for hunting and fishing. This refuge brought new hope for these Acadian families, who named it Camp of Esperance, or the Camp of Hope. As it turned out, it became a place of great suffering and privation for those who had fled deportation and the destruction of their homeland. So these are people who actually didn't get put on the ships. They escaped and they fled into the woods of Nova Scotia, right? And they made this, they settled in this region called Miramichi. So and they suffered a lot. So it didn't really turn out too good for them. It says, by directing these refugees to the Miramichi under the protection of a garrison commanded by French-Canadian officer Charles Deschamps, de Boishebert, the government of New France thought they would benefit from its strategic location that was easier to defend and supply. However, corrupt officials embezzled the money. I told you it's all business. They don't care about their own people, allotted to buy provisions for these refugees. Left to fend for themselves and suffering from famine and from epidemic of smallpox, hundreds of Acadian refugees at Camp Esperance died during the winter of 1756-1757. This was one of the worst episodes in the history of the Grand Derangement. Survivors of the Miramichi eventually settled in the maritime provinces of Quebec and Louisiana. All right? These people are going through traumatic things. This is very deep history with the Acadians. The Census of Canada, 1665 to 1871. Resemblance to Canada, Statistics of Canada, Volume 4. This is from 1876. Says here, from September to December 1755 took place the banishment from the peninsula of 6,000 Acadians who were sent off 5 detachments as follows: 1,500 to Virginia, 2,000 to Carolina, 1,200 to Maryland, 400 to Pennsylvania, and 900 to Boston, according to their memoir by M.D. La Rochette in Paris Archives. The letter from the Acadians of Port Royal dated from St. John River, July 1756, to their former missionary, Mr. Dowden, and what remains of the English records of the time of the 2,200 persons who escaped runaways, the proscription. All right, 2,200 people running away, escaping. Listen, where were they going again? Back home, back north, right? Most likely. 1,200 remained in the peninsula, concealed in the woods and along the seashores, living by hunting and fishing in the greatest distress. The other 1,000 went to swell the population of St. John Island in the district of Acadia. All right, so that's before they had been sent. They had 2,000 of them had escaped. As the later district had been ravaged by the burning of a part of the settlement and crops in the neighborhood of Bilbasen, the wretchedness there was extreme and the mortality enormous. In 1756, a good number of the banished had found means to return, some by taking possessions of the ships by which they were transported, others in small boats. That's big right there, because they tell you a lot of the times that these so-called mysterious free people of color, free slaves arrived in this place because they took over a slave ship, right? They took over a slave ship and took it over and crashed, landed in this part of the world, whatever they always say, right? We got a great example of Acadians doing that, taking over possession of ships that they were being put into chains on, right, as servants, and going back home with it, like landing, taking control of the ship. Nearly 1,400 in all went to St. John River, and a small number landed on the western shores of Nova Scotia. But death visited them, and the whole Acadian population, in spite of these returns, increased that year only by about 800. By 1756, 1758, a comparative large immigration to Canada took place, and the mortality of the coast was enormous. They were dying. A letter from Bishop of Quebec says that in 1757 there were 900 refugees at Miramachi, of whom it is known that 200 died in a single winter. The taking of Louisbourg in July 1758 diminished the population of Cape Breton from 2,500 to 700. 1,700 were transported to La Rochelle. That was back to France, right? They went back to France, right? 700 remained on the island, and the small number now represented by these figures went to increase the population of St. John Island. That's from 1756 to 58 to 1765, the property of the Acadians of St. John Island was taken possession, and they were driven out, reducing this population from 6,500 souls to 1,400, but increasing the population of the district of Quebec, the shores, and the Bay des Chaleurs. From 1765 to 1771, the mortality in the population of the Gulf shores was so large, right? The mortality was so large, these are so-called black people, so large as to cause comparatively important immigration to Canada. The descendants of the Acadians are met with everywhere by thousands in the province of Quebec, but especially in the Magdalen Islands, the county of Bonaventure, the North Shore, the counties of Bellechasse, Beauce, Champlain, Nicollet, Mashinongi, Modicum, Assomption, La Prairie, St. John, and Iberville. So it goes into a little bit more of what they went through. They were going into Santo Domingo, Martinique. It says here, let me get that part of return. Some of them were returned or sent to France. About 3,500 settled in the British colonies, Louisiana, Saint Domingo, Martinique, and elsewhere. About 1,500 emigrated to the province of Quebec. About 3,500 excess of deaths over births during this period, 1,500. All right. So they get in very specific, showing you real numbers. All right. Show me one slave ship from Africa. I'll wait. With numbers. All right. So these are the numbers, as you can see. And just a little diagram. So heading over to France, going back to Nova Scotia, from France to South America, even South Africa. Yep, they were getting sent to South Africa and South America, the Caribbean, back to the colonies, and Louisiana, right? Acadia up here, Acadia, Louisiana. All right, what is this? Looks like a triangle to me. Now, this looks like a triangle to me. Doesn't it to you? All right. The Great and Noble Scheme, the tragic story of the expulsion of the French Acadians from their American homeland, by John MacFarlane. On September 4, 1755, the Pennsylvania Gazette printed a dispatch from the maritime province of Nova Scotia, we are now upon a great and noble scheme of sending the neutral French out of this province, who have always been secret enemies or secret Jews, right? Secret cryptos. So what do you mean by that? And have encouraged our savages to cut our throats. So they don't like that they're hooking up with the savages or Indians either. If we effect their expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that ever the English did in America. For by all accounts, a part of the country they possess is good land. All right, they got good land, as any in the world, and in case therefore we could get some good English farmers in their room, the province would abound with all kinds of provisions. At the time these words were published, New England troops acting under the authority of the colonial governors of Nova Scotia and Massachusetts were systematically rounding up more than 7,000 Acadians, the French-speaking Catholic inhabitants who lived, right, now they're calling them Catholics. Dodge the hijack. We already got the drop that a lot of them were Protestants and their whole families were Huguenots, Protestants, and that many of their so-called Catholics were actually converts, right? Huguenots. And and we also got the drop that many of them by a certain period couldn't practice their Protestant religion, so they had to convert to Catholicism eventually. So yeah, they all became Catholics or known as Catholics, who lived in communities along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. Men, women, and children alike were crowded into transport vessels and deported in small groups to the British colonies across continent of North America, all right? Put on ships, Swarthy Acadians, Swarthy French. Many families were separated, wives from husbands, daughters from mothers, some never to meet again. 10,000 or more fled into the forest and spent years living as homeless refugees. Forest, who were they living with, huh? Thousands of them were captured and deported to France. Captured and deported to France, while others took up arms in guerrilla resistance. Meanwhile, their property was plundered. Their communities were torched, their lands were seized. The campaign to extirpate the Acadian peoples lasted until the end of the 7-Year War in 1763 and cost thousands of lives in the aftermath. Hundreds of surviving Acadians returned to the places they had come to call home over the previous 150 years, but not to their old homes on the Bay of Fundy, which in the meantime had been settled by Yankee families from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. All right. So 150 years, they were kind of like, imagine living somewhere for 150 years and then somebody just deporting you, just like that. Louisiana. So other Acadians migrated to French Louisiana, named the ancestor of today's Cajuns. Piercing together the scattered remnants of Acadian civilization, the documents and sources buried deep in archives, historian John Farraher provides the first comprehensive, thoroughly researched and historically accurate account of the expulsion from both British and Acadian points of view. It is a story filled with fascinating historical characters, native Mi'kmaq who enjoyed a friendly relationship of cultural exchange and accommodation with the Acadian settlers. French and British governors and military officers isolated and lonely outposts, Yankee merchants and ministers motivated by enterprise and ideology, and ordinary Acadian men and women who insisted on their right to live their own lives in their own independent ways on the margins of contestant empires. It is a story of ethnic cleansing in early America, a story with a special poignancy in our own time. It says here in chapter 1, the French colonization of Acadia began in earnest on 13 May 1606 when the Jonas, a vessel of 150 tons loaded with provisions and carrying 40 men, weighed anchor in the port of La Rochelle. All right, that was in France, a Huguenot town, and sailed for the infant outpost of Port Royal. All right, so they came from a Huguenot town on the far side of the Atlantic. This was 7 months before the departure of English colonists for Jamestown. So they were there before the English colonized Virginia, and 14 years before the landing of the Mayflower. All right, they were there first. In fact, by 1606, Frenchmen had been fishing in North American waters for decades, landing on the shore of the North Atlantic coast to dry their catch and trading with the native hunters for furs, particularly beaver pelts, which could be fashioned into waterproof material for coats and hats. But this expedition, under the command of Jean de Biencourt, Sieur de Pontrycourt, or of Pontrycourt, a 50-year-old aristocrat from the barony, he was a Huguenot who had converted to Catholicism. The St. Jews and the region of Champlain would establish the first French agricultural colony of North America coast in North America. It says here, Sieur de Pontrecourt was the associate of Pierre de Goua, Sieur de Mons, Viceroy and Captain General of New France, a vast swath of North America extending along the Atlantic coast from the 40th to the 46th degree of latitude from Delaware Bay in the south to Newfoundland in the north, a veteran officer in the army of King Henry IV. During the civil wars of religion fought between the French Catholics and French Protestant Huguenots. All right, so again, this Sieur de Pontrecourt, he was on the side of Henry IV, who was on the French Protestant side, fighting the Catholics. All right, he was a Huguenot. In the late 16th century, de Mons was described by one contemporary as a man of le coeur porté de choses hautes, literally high-hearted, which was to say a daring and adventurous disposition. Think of him as a French Sir Walter Raleigh, basically probably family. Remember who the Raleighs or de la Rale is? De la Rale, Spanish family, Sephardic Jews. We got the drop on the past videos on this same series. All right, his royal appointment provided him a monopoly of the lucrative fur trade of northeastern North America, but in turn required him in the name of the king to people and cultivate the region, to plant towns and build fortifications, to establish, extend, and make known our name, power, and authority, and to subject, submit, and render obedient thereto all the tribes of this land. Who they talking about? Talking about Huguenot Protestants. They wanted their name to be known. Huguenots, Moors to be known, and power to be known, and authority, and to render obedient the native people, the indigenous people of the land. Who? Huguenots, yeah. To summon and instruct them, provoke and rouse them to the knowledge of God and to the light of the Christian faith and religion, and to establish it among them. Hunter had no objection to doing business with Huguenots, for although he was a Catholic, listen to this, in the context of the times, he was a practical one. During the wars of religion, he fought for the church, but came over to the side of Henry of Navarre in 1593 when the king converted to Catholicism in order to ensure his succession to the throne, right? So these were Huguenots converting to Catholicism. De Mons was a Protestant, Pontrecourt a Catholic, but they united in their enthusiasm of Acadia. They were the same people. Henry's patent called for Catholic instruction and conversion of the savages, but he raised no objection to the inclusion of Huguenot ministers in the expedition of 1604 and 1606. So if he was Catholic, why would he bring on Moorish Protestant people who they were warring with? Both Catholics and Huguenots were aboard the Grâce de Dieu when she departed the P in late February 16. Okay, so that's when they came. The enthusiastic welcome of member two's Mi'kmaq came as a relief. Anxious about their old friends, wrote Les Carber the Mi'kmaq, asked how they were all getting along, calling each individual by his name and asking why especially such one had not come back. So you see the Indians were so friendly. They remembered when they had gone there initially during their scouting expedition for land. They had met some of the Mi'kmaqs and they were even welcoming when they came back. It says here the French fur trade of the early 17th century might not be able to support a colonial settlement, but it certainly can produce handsome profits. On his last visit to Port Royal in 1614, Pontrecourt was accompanied by David Lomeron, a merchant associated with the prominent Huguenot firm of Georges and McCain in La Rochelle. All right, Huguenot, ding, 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 word of the day, Moor, Moorish, cryptos. All right, so Huguenots and Acadia all over the place. In remarkable letters to Louis XIII and the king's principal ministers, Cardinal Richelieu, he complained of his isolation and warned that the English, who had sent a fleet to relieve the Huguenots of La Rochelle, would use the occasion to attempt a seizure of Acadia with a lucrative fisheries and fur trade. All right, they had to relieve the Huguenots of La Rochelle and they sent them to Acadia. The Kirk brothers, son of a Scottish merchant and a French Huguenot woman of Dieppe, Scottish merchant, they're probably the same people, remember, who was the Scottish Black Scots. And these merchants, they were just Sephardic Moorish people. They found a good deal in common with their captive Claude de la Tour, who also had been raised a Huguenot. Claude de la Tour, another founder, another colonist, another explorer, who was also a Huguenot Moor. The Kirks introduced him to the extensive network of expatriate Huguenots in London. The network they had, remember, the business ties, the poor Jews, remember the network they had. Although he had been careful not to make an issue of his religious background in France, Latour found that it provided him with access to influence in England. So when it was for convenience, he's like, yeah, I'm Huguenot. Yeah, I'm with you guys. We're family. I'm Sephardic. Yeah, let's do business. It's all about the money, baby. Right? For them, at least. At about the same time, the alumni's rival, Charles Latour, contracted for a similarly advantaged marriage to Francois Marie Jacqueline, a young Huguenot woman from a town southwest of Paris. The marriage settlement made no mention of a dowry, but the Jacqueline family members of the lesser nobility must have added to Latour's network of support within the French Huguenot community. All right, Huguenot. We know that when these Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in south of France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became Huguenots. Moors became Huguenots. Moors became Huguenots. Moors became Huguenots. The largest immigration of all occurred with the so-called Huguenots, who, as we shall see, were in many cases second or third generation Spanish and Portuguese Jews who traded their French colors for English and Flemish or some other nationality as they fled religious persecution. Huguenots were Moors. Go back. Because during the period of English interregnum, a distinctive Acadian ethnic culture took shape. The inhabitants had come from a variety of backgrounds, Catholic but also Huguenot, Moorish, French but also Micmac. They're French, so-called French, but they also might be Micmac Indians, Micmac, English, Irish, even Spanish. So all that you have to kind of like break down to see what they mean. You know, the whole genealogy. We got to start getting specific. Their culture was a combination of old and new. Their families were patriarchal and extended, and although some were better off than others, their society essentially egalitarian. All right, continuing, it says here, the Compagnie de la Nouvelle France had been disbanded in 1663, but another took its place. The Compagnie Sénateur de Pache l'Acadie, better known simply as the Compagnie of Acadia, headed by Clerbeau Berger, a Huguenot merchant, of course, adventured from La Rochelle, of course, a Huguenot town where Moors had settled. All right, Moors had settled in La Rochelle. That's where Moors were living. Determined to drive out the English from Acadian waters in 1683, Berger seized a number of New England fishing and trading vessels. In retaliation, Massachusetts privateers or pirates commanded several French vessels. The Acadian inhabitants, however, were adamantly opposed to the company's imposition of trading monopoly and openly sympathized with the New Englanders. So even the Acadians did business still with the English. They didn't know they were about to kick them out eventually, right? And then it goes on here. Next screenshot says the Borgias of Bebason and Lewis Island of Port Royal sent lumber and flour into their own slopes and brought back trade goods to sell to their Acadian customers. Charles de Saint Etienne de la Tour frequently procured supplies for his trading post of Cape Sable, clearing Boston Harbor with cargoes that included fabric and thread and iron tools, brass and copper kettles, vermilion, soap, tobacco, and rum. Acadian Abraham Boudreau, a Port Royal, formed a trading partnership with Belgian-born Huguenot Andrew Faneuil of Boston. All right, that's a big one for me because I'm from Boston, and there's this place called Faneuil Hall right in the middle of the city. It's like, right in downtown, blue-collar business, colonial area. And this building is really famous. It's from colonial times. And recently I'm finding out that Faneuil, the guy who built it, he was a Huguenot. And look what it says here. Andrew Faneuil of Boston, because Acadia was now under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts, and men such as Boudreau had taken oath of allegiance to English monarchs. Yeah, so Faneuil Hall in Boston was built by a Moor. Yeah, a Muslim Moor that had settled in France, that had become known as Acadian or French. And he built Faneuil Hall. It still stands today. You can Google Faneuil Hall today. Though they were solid Acadian credentials, the Melanson brothers were in fact English immigrants and not French by birth. Both converted to Catholicism, right? They weren't Catholics, they converted. This is what I was telling you earlier. The Acadians are not just Catholic. That's what they became known as when they married, yet they had been raised Protestant by their parents. Priscilla Malleson, a woman from Yorkshire, and Pierre Malleson de Laverdure, a Huguenot refugee who fled from La Rochelle, a Huguenot Moorish town, to England in the aftermath of the siege of 1627. All right. The couple married in 1631, raised 3 sons, and in midlife emigrated to Acadia with Governor Thomas Temple and his entourage settling at Riviere St. Jean. All right. The Melancons. All right. And the Laverdures, Huguenots. And it's talking about here about the Melancons' youngest son, Jean, when Boston took John Laverdure, hired him to privateer an expedition and intended using King Philip's War as cover for slave raiding. These are Moorish people. Listen to this. Huguenots. They hired onto a privateering expedition that intended using King Philip's War as a cover for slave raiding along the main coast. Who you think they're slave raiding? Posing as an Acadian trader, Labrador successfully lured 26 Abenakis aboard the vessel. The men and women were bound, transported to the Azores, not Africans, Abenakis, who are Swarthy, Negro Abenakis, Swarthy, sent to the Azores by other Moorish Swarthy people. Yes, more and more war. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's not about complexion. 2 New England traders who witnessed the auction filed a complaint with Massachusetts authorities who arrested Labrador and his associates when they returned to Boston. So they were using the King Philip's War, as an excuse for slave raiding Indians, right? Not Africans, Indians. And the funny thing is, these people are refugees. They're fleeing persecution. They're going through their own thing throughout history, and yet they come and do the same thing to other people. Right? In 1682, says here, 18-year-old Marie married David Bassett, a Huguenot merchant of Boston who was active in the Acadian trade. Huguenot merchant. Cecil, another of Charles Melancon's daughter, married the Acadian merchant Abraham Boudreau of Port Royal. Huguenot Moor merchant, the Moorish merchant of Boston, David Bassett. The first sign of Acadian resistance came in January 1711. Vetch had sent the garrison commissary of a Huguenot from Bordeaux named Peter Capone. Capone and Noriega. Capone, Huguenot, Capone and Noriega. What? To negotiate the purchase of grain from Pierre LeBlanc, captain of Port Royal militia, a chief inhabitant of Haute Riviere. All right. Capone, Huguenot, Moors, Capone, Moor, Mr. Capone. Let's see a Franco-American overview, volume 1. In 1562, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a noted French military officer and a Huguenot leader, right? A Huguenot leader called together several hundred French Protestants to take part in the first colonization attempt in North America. A previous endeavor in Brazil in 1555 had proven unsuccessful. Colonial ordered Jean Ribault, a French navigator, to lead an expedition to the New World in an effort to find a suitable location for the Huguenot colony. All right, a Huguenot colony, straight up. A Moorish colony. Who's the Huguenots? For a Moorish colony in Acadia. Once there, the admiral hoped that his people would lead a pleasant life. His Moorish people will live a pleasant life free from religious oppression. Ribault and the exiled Huguenots settled not far from the present site of Jacksonville, Florida, and also at Port Royal, South Carolina. And this new land, wild and foreign, the first European colonists found life quite difficult. As a result, they fell into a state of discord, rendering themselves vulnerable to all potential opposing forces. Resumption of exploration in North America. In 1598, King Henry IV proclaimed the Edict of Nantes. Through this edict, Protestants were assured the right to practice their religion without fear of persecution. During the first decade of the 17th century, Henry IV sent Samuel de Champlain, a former Huguenot converted to Catholicism, on a series of voyages abroad. Champlain established the first permanent settlement in Canada at Port Royal on the Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia in 1605. This is way before the Pilgrims, before the Jamestown colonists, all right? Moors were already up in Canada. Another established in 1608 later became the city of Quebec, all right? The The Myth of the Savages, and the Beginning of French Colonialism in the Americas. That's the book. While the policy of creating one race was doomed to failure in New France, as elsewhere, Amerindians and French were still distinct entities at the end of French regiment in 1760. Still, there was enough intermixing for a writer in South Carolina newspaper in 1742 to refer to the French as Swarthy brethren of Amerindians. The French were what? Swarthy. They were black. The French were black brethren of Amerindians. Listen to this. Now, we know they just described the Indians as Swarthy, right? So Swarthy Indians and Swarthy French people, right? So if they come together, what do you think is going to happen? Listen to what happens. Shortly afterward, in 1753, Abbe Maillard noted that intermixing had already proceeded. So for that, in his opinion, in 50 years, it would be impossible to distinguish Amerindian from French in Acadia. It's impossible. Why? How could it be impossible? When we understand and overstand now why. Because they're both Swarthy. They're both Swarthy. They may look the same. They might have similar features. They might be anciently related. But either way, how can you misplace an Indian from an Acadian, right? If Acadians are white, right, and they dress a specific way, and Indians are a specific way and look a specific way, as how they told us, how can they? All right, so they tell us that they look more Mongolish, right, Indians? So how could a Mongolish Indian look like a white European? How can you mistake that? How can you not distinguish that? You get what they're saying, you hear, right? Swarthiness all over the place. You can't distinguish who's who. And how often did this happen in history, in American history? And we only remembering the Indian part, because we always assume the European was white. So that had nothing to do with us. That was just the name we took on. Or that was just the slave master who raped my great. No, man. I love you. You know, two major genealogies. That's what I'm trying to show you here. By the Marshes of Minas, by Charles G.D. Roberts, author of The Forest in the Forest. All right. It says here, Gaspar of the Black Lemerchants. Of the village floor is a thick beech wood stretching over toward the mouth of the river inhabitants, and there by the river part of Grand Prix, yet set apart from her, was the little settlement of the Black Lemerchants. Who's these Black Lemerchants? With its barley and flax fields, hand from the beech wood, its snug acres of dike marsh snatched from the habitants' tide. The Lemerchant men were dark. Listen to this. The Lemerchant men were dark. Even for Acadians. Yo, even for Acadians, even though they're Acadians, nah, these dudes are dark, man. Like, yo, you see what they're saying, right? Listen to the words. Even for Acadians, they were dark. That means Acadians were dark-skinned. They were known to be dark-skinned and very dark-skinned. But this particular group of men or family, the Lemerchants, were very, very dark complexion. Even for Acadians, all right? Even for Acadians. Unlike their fellows, they were of Basque rather than Normandy or Picardy blood, swarthy of skin, black-haired, black-bearded, and with heavy, coal-black eyebrows meeting over the nose, all right? Remember I told you, so we got Acadians who are Norman ancestry and Acadians who come from Basque ancestry, both swarthy people. The Basques were very, very so-called black. Very dark. They're described many times as very dark. The Basque people, original Basque. They well deserve their name. All right, they well deserve their name. The Black Lemerchants. Black as of all. A Lemerchant of the Lemerchants was Gaspar, son of Pierre. The blackest of all of them, Gaspar. He was the blackest of all of them. Says here, Secret Plays of Thunder by Portland Morris. Richard Duval laughed heartily and was joined by the boatman Octave. Shiloh narrowed his eyes as he considered the Swarthy Acadian. Swarthy Acadian absolutely refuses to speak English. He thought irritably, but I did hear him that first night. The Swarthy Acadian. So Swarthy. Swarthy Acadian, black Acadian. The dark-skinned Acadian. Chronicles of Canada, edited by George M. Wrong and H. H. Langton in 32 volumes. The Acadian Exiles by Arthur G. Doughty. By right of discovery of Jean Verrazano. Jean Verrazano and Jacques Cartier. The French crown laid claim to all of America north of the spirit of Spanish influence. Colonial enterprise, however, did not thrive during the religious wars which rent Europe in the 16th century. And it was not until after the Edict of Nantes in 1598 that France could follow up the discoveries of her seamen by an effort to colonize either Acadia or Canada. Abortive attempts had indeed been made by the Marquis de la Roche, but these had resulted only in the marooning of 50 unfortunate convicts marooning on Sable Island. The first real colonizing venture of the French in the New World was that of the Sieur de Mons, the patron and associate of Champlain. Remember, these were two Huguenots. The site of this first colony was in Acadia. Armed with viceregal powers and a trading monopoly for 10 years, de Mons gathered his colonists, equipped with 2 ships, and set out from Havre de Grace in April 1604. The company numbered about 150 Frenchmen of various ranks and conditions, from the lowest to the highest. Convicts taken from the prisons, convicts again, laborers and artisans, Huguenot ministers and Catholic priests, some gentlemen of noble birth, among them Jean de Biencourt, Baron de Pontrecourt. Again, all these people were Huguenots. We already got the drop. So I just want to get to chapter 10 about the exile part, right? So it says here in chapter 10 of this book, it says, thus the Acadians passed from the land of their birth and from the scenes of their youth, somewhere to wander as exiles in many lands. For many years, exiles in many lands, separated, right? Exiled in your own land, exiled in many lands for many years, exiles. Deuteronomy 28, separated from their children, from their kind, while others, more fortunate, were soon to regain their native soil. Lawrence, in his instructions to the governors of the colonies to which he had sent the exiles, said that they were to be received and disposed of in such manner as may be best answer our design of preventing their reunion as a people. It was not intended, all right? So strategically, they made sure they separated them. They didn't want them to reunite and get back together. Preventing their reunion as a people. What people? Moorish people, as a Sephardic Moorish people. It was not intended to tear apart families and friends, but owing to the scarcity of vessels and the inadequate arrangements for the deportation, there were many cruel separations, all right? They told us that was happening to Africans. But we already got the drop on the indentured servitude system and the spirited way how they were kidnapping many Europeans, black Europeans, Huguenot Sephardic Jews, expelled Moors from Spain, Palatines from Germany, Irish, black Irish. This was happening to real people. This was really happening to real people, not a fake story, Kunte Kinte. They got their ideas from real stories, real life stories. People being separated by force, put on ships, sent to plantations to work as slaves. Not talking about Africans. The deputies confined since July on George Island, for example, were at the last moment transferred to Annapolis in order that they might accompany their families, but this was not effected, nor the deputies themselves landed in North Carolina, while their wives and children were dispersed in other colonies. All right, the colonies, their children, Moorish people. One of the leading Acadians and one who had loyally served the British, René Leblanc, notary of Grand Prix, was landed in his wife and his 2 youngest children in New York, while his 18 other children were scattered far and wide. 18 other. They was like, yo, you know what? You get to keep these 2. The other 18, sorry, we need some free labor. The real separation of families, however, began in the colonies. For example, 400 persons were transported to Connecticut, but before the whole number arrived, an order went forth for their dispersion in 50 towns. 19 were allotted to Norwich, while 3 only were sent to Haddon. In some colonies, only the first boats were allowed to disembark. The exiles and the masters of the others were forced to seek other ports. The treatment of the exiles in the colonies varied according to circumstance. In some instances, the younger men and women were bound out to service for periods varying from 3 to 12 weeks. In others, they were left free to maintain themselves by their own efforts, provide for such as were incapable, though age or infirmity, of performing manual labor. Hundreds of those who were placed under control escaped, all right, in the East Coast, in plantations, swarthy, so-called black people from Canada, Acadians, escaping, and they wandered footsore and half-clad from town to town in the hope of meeting their relatives or finding means to return to their former homes. Where was that? Going north, right? Going north to Canada from the plantations, escaping, running away, going north, right? Back to Acadia, back home. Little record has been preserved of the journeying of these unfortunates or of the sufferings they endured. Oh, really? Now you see what they're telling us here, right? Little record has been preserved of the journeyings of these unfortunates or of the sufferings they endured. They don't want to tell us, because if they really told us the real drop, we would figure out that these were so-called black people. Acadians were black people, and they were being sent to plantations, and these were the runaways, mainly heading north to Canada. There was a specific reason why. That's why you're telling us that there's little known, right? They don't want to tell us little known what happened. These were the runaway slaves heading north. Was Harriet Tubman. About a third of the people deported from Nova Scotia in 1755 found their way to South Carolina, although that does not appear to have been the destination proposed for them by Lawrence. On November 6, 1755, the South Carolina Gazette announced that the Baltimore Snow is expected from the Bay of Fundy with some French neutrals on board to be distributed in the British colonies to be what? Sold. Distributed, sold. Sold like slaves. Sold in the British colonies. See, because they're talking about Acadians, the language they're using, right? They're keeping it PG-13, as you say, and not rated R or X, right? But if these were known supposedly slaves or Negroes, right, they would be talking about sold instead of distributed. So the language changes. A fortnight later, the first of these arrived. In the course of a few weeks, over 1,000 had been landed at Charleston. 1,000 Moorish people from Acadia in Charleston. Remember, Charleston was a free person of color. Charleston was people of color. South Carolina was mainly people of color in colonial times. We have proven this. Check out my South Carolina video. A lot of those were Huguenots, a lot of Indians being exported, and a lot of things going on in South Carolina. Alarmed by the presence of so many strangers, right? So many of these Moorish people, the authorities adopted measures to place them under restraint. This put them under chains, and in February 1756, two parties of the prisoners broke loose. They broke loose. 30 of them outdistanced their pursuers. 5 or 6, according to the Gazette, made their way to the plantation of Mr. Williams on the Santee. Terrified, the family secured a quantity of clothing and firearms, broke open a box containing money, and headed across the Alleghanies. All right, so listen to what these guys did. These are black, so-called black people from Acadia, escaping bondage, right? Running away, so-called Negro people running away, right? Going into some plantation, holding them hostage, taking their money, and then heading out with guns and stuff. These people didn't play. These sounds like Maroons, no? Just like Maroons did. It was thought for the French stronghold, Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh now stands. This conjecture is probable, since 9 Acadians from Fort Duquesne arrived at the river St. John sometime later. In the interval, the South Carolina legislature passed an act for the dispersion of 4/5 of the French neutrals in various parishes at the public expense, the remaining fifth to be supported at Charleston by the vestry of St. Philip's. On April 16th, passports were given to 130 persons to proceed to Virginia. Here they obtained the authority of the governor to return to Acadia, and they reached the river St. John on June 16, 1756. Some time later, the governor of South Carolina gave the remainder of the peoples permission to go where they pleased. 2 old ships and a quantity of inferior provisions were placed at their disposal, and they sailed for Hampton, Virginia. In due course, 900 of them landed in the district of the river St. John, where they were employed by Vaudreuil, the governor of New France, and harrying the British. By the year 1763, only 283 Acadians remained in South Carolina. One family of the name of Lanoux became Protestants and gave 2 ministers to the Presbyterian Church. They were always Protestants, and Protestant is not anything. Those are Sephardic Moorish people. And remember earlier I was telling you, and they told us that Huguenots, Moorish people, gave leaders to Presbyterians, Huguenots, all that. Presbyterian, all these Christian divisions came out of the struggle that Sephardic Jews and Moorish Muslims went through with Catholics, and they didn't ever want to become fully Catholics, so they created these own denominations, these religions, right? These sects, Christian sects, right? Presbyterian, Quaker, Protestant, Baptist. All right. So again, Moorish people helping establish and found these things, and gave 2 ministers to the Presbyterian Church. They became ministers of Presbyterians, right? Moorish people, Presbyterian Church. The Reverend John Lanoux, who afterwards went as a missionary to Jerusalem, and the Reverend Basil Lanoux, who became a Hebrew tutor in the Theological Seminary at Columbia. So again, all of a sudden, he speaks Hebrew, right? He became a Protestant, but now he speaks Hebrew. So doesn't that mean he was always a Hebrew Sephardic crypto? You see? Among the refugees who put out from Minas on October 13, 1755, were some 450 destined for Philadelphia. The vessels touched Delaware on November 20th when it was discovered that there were several cases of smallpox on board, and the masters were ordered to leave the shore. They were not permitted to land at Philadelphia the 10th of December. You see that? A whole month. Many of the exiles died during the winter and were buried in the cemetery of the poor, which now forms a part of Washington Park, Philadelphia. If you know this park, yeah, those are Moorish Acadians who were really treated really bad, died because they were left on a ship to die, and they got buried here in Washington Park in Philadelphia. All right. Real history. The survivors were logged in a poor quarter of the town in neutral huts, as their mean dwellings were termed. When the plague-stricken people arrived, Philadelphia had scarcely recovered from panic of a recent earthquake. Moreover, there was a letter said to have been written by Lawrence, dated at Halifax, August 6, and published in the Philadelphia Gazette on September 4th, not calculated to place the destitute refugees in a favorable light. This is the substance of the letter. We are now forming the noble project of driving the French neutrals out of this province. We don't want them here. They have long been our secret enemies. Why do they keep meaning by that? Why do they keep calling our secret enemies? Secret crypto enemy? Crypto, yeah. They're enemies of Catholics. They've been playing it off, pretending to be Catholics, but they were secret crypto Jews, crypto Muslims, or secret Jews, secret Muslims, or secret enemies, and have assisted the Indians, and they also kept getting with the Indians. If we are able to accomplish the expulsion, it will be one of the great achievements of the English in America. For among other considerations, the lands which they occupy are among the best in the country, and we can place good English farmers in their stead. A few days later, another letter was published to the effect that 3 Acadians had been arrested, charged with poisoning the wells in the vicinity of Halifax. Their trial, it was stated, had not yet taken place, but if guilty, they would have but a few hours to live. Robert Hunter Morris, the governor of this time of Pennsylvania, wrote to Shirley of Massachusetts saying that as he had not sufficient troops to enforce order, he feared that the Acadians would unite with the Irish, who were also Swarthy and German Catholics, in a conspiracy against the state. Yeah, that would have happened definitely. German Palatines, a lot of those were Moors who were Huguenots who were driven into Germany, became known as Palatines. All right. And Irish, we already know the Irish, Protestant Irish history. He also addressed the government of New Jersey to the same effect. The governor of New Jersey, in his reply, expressed surprise that those who planned to send the French neutrals, or rather rebels, and traitors to the British crown had not realized that there were already too many strangers for the peace and security of the colonies, that they should have been sent to old France. They should have sent them back to Europe. Old France, they're saying, right? That's New France. Or old France, who knows? He was quite in accord with Morris and believing there was a danger of the people joining the Irish Papists. Why would they want to join the Irish Papists? You got to understand real history and real genealogy of the so-called Irish in Philadelphia at that time. Yeah, they would have got together. Most likely they end up being cryptos too, or Protestants, right? The Acadians had arrived at Philadelphia in a most deplorable condition. One of the Quakers who visited the boats while they were in quarantine reported that they were without shirts and socks and were sadly in need of a bedcloth, and a petition to the governor giving an account of their conduct in Acadia and of the treatment they had received fell on deaf ears. An act was passed for their dispersion in the counties of Bucks, Lancaster, and Chester. The refugees, however, were not without friends. So several Quakers, they were indebted for many acts of kindness and generosity. Now, why were the Quakers helping these people a lot? Now, remember who else the Quakers in history were helping, right? Weren't they helping runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad? Quakers. They're also helping Acadians who are going north to Canada. What a coincidence. Among those deported to Philadelphia was one of the LeBlanc's family, a boy of 17, Charles LeBlanc. Remember, LeBlancs were Huguenots. Early in life, he engaged in commerce, and in the course of a long and successful career in Philadelphia, amassed an enormous fortune, including large estates in the colonies and in Canada. After his death in 1816, there were many claimants to his estate, and the litigation over it is not yet ended. The Acadians, taken to New York, were evidently as poor as their fellow refugees at Philadelphia. An act of July 6, 1755 recites that a certain number have been received into this colony, poor, naked, and destitute of every convenience and support of life, and to the end that they may not continue as they now really are, useless to His Majesty, to themselves, and a burden to this colony. Be it enacted that the justices of peace be required and empowered to bind with respectable families, such as are not arrived at the age of 21 years for such a space of time as they may think proper. The justices were to make the most favorable contracts for them, and when their term of service expired, they were to be paid either in implements of trade, clothing, or other gratuity. All right? So, blah, 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 blah. Basically, they're making indentured servitude sound fancy. All right? That's a contract. And when you did your free labor, then you got it. That's an indenture. They don't want to picture these people, portray these people as slaves. In the month of August 1756, 110 sturdy Acadian boys and girls made their appearance in New York. They had traveled all the way from Georgia. Acadian boys and girls, Swarthy, little so-called Negro, so-called black boys and girls. Yeah, black, Swarthy, very Swarthy. Remember, even for an Acadian, he was Swarthy. Remember, Acadians are Swarthy. Let's not forget. So we got Swarthy little boys and girls from Georgia finding their way to New York. They had traveled all the way from Georgia in the hope to find a means to return to Acadia, trying to go back home. They might have escaped, right? Could these people have been mistaken for so-called African slaves escaping, trying to flee to North for freedom because there was no slavery there? Yes. Yes, they did. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. That's what I'm trying to explain to you guys. The great was their disappointment when they were seized by the authorities and placed out of the service. Later, some of the parents straggled in, but they were dispersed immediately in Orange and Westchester counties, and some on Long Island, in charge of a constable. The New York Mercury of July 1757 reported that a number of the neutrals had been captured near Fort Edward while on their way to Crown Point, between the arrival of the first detachment in New York. At the month of August 1757, the colony was compelled to provide for large numbers who came in from distant places to prevent any further escape, and sheriffs were commanded to secure all the Acadians except women and children in the county gaol. Now, I want to explain to you guys something, all right? Why would they care so much, all these other states, of these people trying to head home to freedom? Why would they be detaining them, all right? These were runaway slaves. This is what not, they're not, the language they're using is different, because if these were so-called Negroes, they'd be saying, oh, slave catchers will get them, and the slaves will be returned, and they were blah, 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 blah. But now they're just trying to make it seem like, oh, somehow they got stopped by the authorities. What authorities? Slave catchers. Remember, you got money for slave catching. Returning it to as rewards. All right. They were doing things to prevent this from happening. People runaways, black swarthy Acadians. At a later date, these unfortunates were put on to a strange use. Sir Harry Moore, governor of the colony of New York, had designs upon the French colony at Santo Domingo in the West Indies and desired plans of the town and its fortifications. So he entered into correspondence with the French admiral Count d'Estaing, offering to transport thither 70 Acadian families in order that they might live under the French flag. All right, they were trying to send these people to work in the West Indies, right? Again, as indentured servants, so-called slaves. Again, these are swarthy people. So what do you think is going to happen when they end up in the West Indies? They get grouped in as Negroes. They get forgotten in history as so-called Africans, right? Hispaniola, right? A lot of those people escape and becoming Maroons. Again, we're not just Indians. We're not just people coming from Europe, but Acadians, people, other black people from North America, possibly Indians from North America. Not just local Indians. What I meant earlier. So a lot of things to break down specifically. The Count accepted the offer and issued a proclamation to the Acadians inviting them to Santo Domingo. Moore had arranged that John Hanson should conduct the exiles to their new home. John Hanson, Hanson, on arriving at the French colony, was to take a contract to build houses and make out the desired military plans while so engaged. He succeeded in transporting the Acadians, but failed in the real object of his mission. He was not allowed the liberty of building houses in Santo Domingo. The Acadians who went to the West Indies suffered greatly again. These Acadians who were Huguenots, the Huguenots were suffering greatly a lot in their time from being Moors. They become Acadians, then they get persecuted, then they're still getting persecuted even after landing in place. They're still trying to move them other places. Now they're sending them to the West Indies, and again, suffering greatly. The tropical climate proved disastrous. The men and women who had been reared in the atmosphere of Bay of Fundy. They crawled under trees and shrubs to escape the rays of the sun. Numbers of them perished, and life became a burden to the others. Far different was the lot of the Acadians who were sent to Maryland. There they were kindly received and found, no doubt, a happier lot than any of the other colonies. So they did good in Maryland. Those landed at Baltimore were at first lodged in private houses and a building belonging to a Mr. Forterall, where they had a little chapel. And it was not long before the frugal and industrious exiles were able to construct small but comfortable houses of their own on South Charles Street, giving to that quarter of the city the name of Frenchtown. All right, these were Acadian, Swarthy, Moorish people. Frenchtown was Moorish people, right? Founders. Many of them found employment on the water side and in navigation. The old infirm picked oakum. Massachusetts at one time counted in the colony 1,040 of the exiles, but all these had not come direct on the ships from Nova Scotia. Many of them had wandered in from other colonies. And it says here in this book, the Acadians in France. Now, this is just real quick, just to show. So there was a group of them, again, that was taken from Nova Scotia, from Acadia, and sent back to France to live over there after living 150 years in Canada. They were taken back to France. All right, this is from Milton P. Reeder Jr. and Norma Goddard Reeder. All right. The Acadian expulsion began in 1755 and continued until the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763, ended the 7-Year War. Throughout this period, the time of Acadian has slowly filtered back into France and settled in the maritime ports of Le Havre, Saint Malo, Duborky, Morlaix, Boulogne, Sherborne, and others. Here, many of them lived in poverty, relying upon the charity of the French government in order to survive. You hear that? Refugees living off welfare, living off the French government in poverty. Early in 1763, after successful negotiations with England, 753 additional Acadians arrived in France. Gone were their homes and farms, many of their loved ones. They had suffered a bitter exile and they returned sick in body and heart. But their love of God and country remained, and they still had hopes that they could somehow build a new life and wipe out their tragic memories. France, however, could not offer them the one thing they needed and wanted most, and that was the fertile farmland they could not till, soil that was untillable, and settlement after settlement collapsed and experiment after experiment failed. That's when they went back to France. They couldn't even settle there back. They became a disillusioned people, suspicious, distrustful, and discouraged. Their very existence became aimless and hopeless. It was then through the humanity of Spain, the humanity of Spain. Again, these Spaniards that started helping had Sephardic Moorish blood. They're helping their people. That these French nationals sailed for Louisiana in 1785 and finally found their home. With it, peace and contentment. All right. All these people, these French families who were being settled, these Spanish grants. All right. We're going to get into that. This is why I wanted to do this video with the Acadians. We can understand the French colonial history. All right. Numerous records were kept on the Acadians during their sojourn in France for 12 years. All right, they were there for 12 years. They had general census there, so they know who was there, the families specifically, all that was recorded. We have tried in this publication to present those lists containing the most information and those which covered most of the period of time the Acadians spent in France. We therefore choose the first of the welfare lists of Royal General of 1762. This roll was compiled by towns indicating each of the Acadian families living in these towns and the names of the ships that transported them there. I just wanted to emphasize that, before a lot of the Acadians became known as Cajuns or French, they were coming in from France, but they weren't coming actually from France. They had been forced to live there for 12 years, but they were Acadians. A lot of those people were already very indigenous people. Like they had mixed in with Indians so much. They were not just French. So, a lot of those people ended up in Louisiana. What does it say here? Port Royal of Acadia. No Acadians were deported from Acadia directly to Louisiana. The old story of Evangeline, which relates an exile to New Orleans, is fictional, as I was telling you earlier, but based on facts of the deportation. All right, so they did add a little truth about the exile of the Acadians, but they added some other folklore into that poem. Any Acadians who ended up in Louisiana got there after having been deported to the French Indies, France, or England, and they found their way to New Orleans. All right. Upon their arrival at the ports where they were dumped off in Louisiana, they quickly assembled in small groups to attempt recapturing their lives and regrouping their families. They were not wanted by the people among which they were deposited, and they were forbidden to form large groups. This forced them into small clusters, among which an information pipeline was formed to pass word along as to who was where and what was happening. So again, why were these places they were being done? Why did they care so much for them to get into large groups and unite? You got to understand that. Why were they afraid of all these Moors? Why was they afraid of all these Muslim Moors and Sephardic Jews to get together, huh? These so-called black people to come together, huh? Why were they so afraid of that? This forced them into small clusters among which all an information pipeline was formed. This news highway soon became highly developed, with information being passed among the colonies and by ship sailors to other parts of the continent. It can be said with a high degree of reliability that from day of deposit on a strange shore, the Acadians continually attempted at regrouping and going back to the homeland they had been exiled from. They were trying to go back home, not because they were trying to go to freedom. They were trying to go back home. And listen to this, all right? Major drop. By spring of 1756, an underground highway leading north, perhaps the model of the Negro Underground Railroad during the American Civil War, had been established, with Acadians skirting the coastline of the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. All right, the model for the Negro Underground Railroad. All right, that was the model for the fake story. You get it? That's the model. That's what they used as the source for their fairy tales of African slaves running away, Harriet Tubman, all that stuff. This is the real story I'm telling you right now. All right? These fairy tales are based on real events. They add a lot of hijack. They give you a little bit of truth, but add a lot of hijack. All right? But this is the model for the Negro Underground Railroad. The Acadians going back home north, not because they were seeking freedom, because the North was free states. No, the North had so-called indentured servants to slaves. The Acadians' creation of a people. The creation of a people. By the time of the Peace of Paris, 1763, Massachusetts computed that it had paid 9,500 pounds for the support of Acadians exiled there. For all this money, the exiles remained alien to the community and suffered an increasingly high death rate. This experience was the common denominator for almost all the other colonies. Administrations tried to settle the Acadians in small groups and to provide for their children by following the custom of binding them out for apprentices. Binding them out, right? If these were supposed to be Negroes, like known historically Negroes, they would be using different language. They'll be selling them to slavery, their children to slavery, selling their children to slavery. That's what they would be saying. They were forced in general to accord the exiles much more freedom or movement than they wished and to support them in similar manner to the provisions made for their own poor. Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania followed the pattern, although it is worth remarking that the Huguenot families of Philadelphia proved greater friends to the Catholic Acadians than might have been expected. Men like Beneset, all right, that's a Sephardic Jewish Moorish name. Beneset, right, is the same people, tried to enlist the services of the Penn brothers on their behalf. The Acadians sent to Maryland ended some years later, mostly in Louisiana, but they made their destination via Santo Domingo. So they had to go to Hispaniola first before they had made it to Louisiana. All right. Those sent to Virginia were dispatched immediately to England. The Virginians arguing that the Acadians were British subjects and entitled to support from London. In the Carolinas and Georgia, the tale becomes even more confused, with the local administrators having much less than total control over the exiles. The Acadian exiles or French neutrals in Pennsylvania. All right, this is what we were just reading about, to which is dependent in relation of their misfortunes, by John Baptist Guillerme. I am proud to say that in their relation to those unfortunate fugitives, all right, fugitives, runaways, right, fugitive, I find on the records of the popular representative body no trace of the malignant animosity and sectarian antipathy which extenuated the executive. He's saying, I don't see no reason why they're messing with these people. Painfully impracticable as Penn's principles had shown themselves when applied to periods of war and invasion and danger from the strong and armed hand without yet when the homeless fugitive and stranger came and asked a place of refuge, the beautiful feature of the Quaker character, charity in its highest sense, and charity too, which knows no difference of creed, seemed more beautiful than ever. The great principle of liberty of conscience and the totalitarian was put in practice towards the exiled Papist, and it certainly is very hard with this unquestioned report before us that the Friends of Pennsylvania should be nowadays charged with mercenary inhumanity. But our meager records show that there was another influence in favor of the exiles. There were hereditary, listen to this, there were hereditary national sympathies at work aside from all matters of technical religion, which gave the French exiles in Philadelphia a welcome that they had no right to expect. They're letting you know they had a common hereditary and ancestry. That's why they were being helped in Pennsylvania or by these people. Papists or not, they were French men and women and children, and they were in Quaker garb. And they were in Quaker garb. Again, all right, big one right there. These Acadians who were runaways, fugitives, they had Quaker clothing on. All right, and who was in Pennsylvania? Quakers, right? Same people, because eventually they go back to crypto, secret Jews, secret Muslims, pretending to be Christians under tags like Quaker, Huguenot, Protestant, Presbyterian, Baptist, and so on and so on. So the Benesets and LaFerrys and the Normandys of Philadelphia came from the same soil years ago, as did the Laundries and Gallerms and LeBlancs and Melancons and Thibaudians. As accordingly, I find that while the assembly paused in no unreasonable delay of counsel, this minute is made. Again, you see why a lot of times they were being helped, and you see why Quakers were helping certain people. Quakers were helping their own people go north, their own Acadian, French, exiled, Sephardic, Moorish people go back home a lot of the time. They weren't just doing it to be kind. Anthony Beneset, attending without was called in and informed the House that he had, at the request of some of the members, visited the French neutrals now on board sundry vessels in the river near the city, and found that they were in great want of blankets, shirts, stockings, and other necessaries. You see how these people were being treated. And he withdrew, whereupon resolved that this house will allow such reasonable expenses as the said benefit may be put to in furnishing the neutral French now in the province. So they decided to help their kin, their family. Anthony Benezet, the Huguenot Quaker, Anthony Benezet, the Moorish Quaker, right? More word of the day. Ding, 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 ding. Huguenot. Huguenots, again, who are the Huguenots? Guys, Moors who were expelled from Spain and Portugal, who had settled in France. Moors, so-called black people. Anthony Benezet, the Black Quaker, was the first almoner to these poor fugitives, and it was with no reluctant gratitude that one of their number in the first memorial to the assembly said, "Blessed be God that it was our lot to be sent to Pennsylvania, where our wants have been relieved, and we have in every respect been treated with Christian belovedness and charity." They got so lucky they were sent there. All right, so we continue, right? We continue, and we're in the Library of Congress right now. This is an old newspaper, the New Orleans Daily Democrat, all right, from 1877. And zoomed into the article, part of the page here says, "Our people, where they came from originally, the source of the population of Louisiana," all right, Louisiana. It was some half a century after this that the first Acadian found his way to Louisiana, all right, Acadians. He came to us persecuted, wanderer, without country or home. He was so hospitably received, fed, clothed, and lodged that well pleased with the country and the people. He pitched his tents upon the soil of Louisiana and peopled his western prairies. All right, pitched his tents, teepees. He pitched his tents. The Acadians were sturdy, stalwart, built race, shown in their disposition and every feature their northern or Norman descent. They were bony, Siouxy, with high cheekbones, and their complexion swarthy and bronze, all their features bearing so close a resemblance to those of our aborigines. Listen to this, all right? They were swarthy complexion, bronze people. The Acadians, French Acadians, right? And they had a so close resemblance to those of our aborigines as to give rise to a somewhat wild theory that the climate of America had an Indianizing effect on Europeans. What? And that a few centuries of it would convert us in complexion and disposition into Sioux and Modocs. The true explanation of the undoubted Indian physiognomy is perhaps more easily and naturally explained in the frequency in the earlier days, listen to this, of Choctaw wives, a custom so prevalent in the colony at one time as to beget a schism between church and state. On this point, the parish priest coolly suggested that if a man could get no better wife than an Indian squaw, he had better remain single altogether. If you can't get a good woman like a Choctaw Indian woman or squaw or an Indian woman, you better stay single. All right? Deep stuff here we're learning. Let's go back. Again, Acadians are what? Swarthy complexion, bronzed. All right? Just in case you don't know what swarthy means, it's dark complexion. All right? And they saying that they resemble Indians. We know a lot of the Acadians were mixing with the indigenous people for years up in Nova Scotia, to the point that they were saying in 50 years we wouldn't be able to tell them apart, remember? And remember the Indians up there were swarthy. Now they're saying that they're also swarthy and they look like Indians too, because not only did they do that in Nova Scotia, but when they were up there in Louisiana and other parts, they were marrying indigenous women. All right. Now, this is what I've been trying to explain to everybody. So you only got, let's say you got only that history of the Choctaw grandma, right? Who did she marry? I'll wait. Was it always an Indian man? Was it always a white slave master? No, a lot of the times it was actual black French people who loved each other. They loved each other. It was both Negro, so-called Negro, black, so-called black people coming together, right? With time, you only remember one side because you assumed the other side was white. And I'm trying to talk real stuff right here to hope nobody's getting hurt and nobody's like feeling like I'm trying to like take their Indian away. I'm just trying to show you another possible ancestry genealogy. And a lot of you, not all of you, a lot of you. So this is deep right here. Oh no! And now they're saying it has to be the weather. Oh, mate, the weather makes Europeans black in America. America has an Indianizing effect. What does that mean? They're straight up telling you that Indians are black. They're straight up telling you without telling you the Indians are black. Indianizing meaning they're being colored. They're becoming more colored. They're somehow swarthy in America, right? They're getting swarthier in America. All right. And again, they were mixing with Choctaw wives. You better get a Choctaw wife if you want a good woman. If not, you better stay single altogether. The Cajun was a prolific as his Canadian cousin. In 1765-66, some of 866 Acadians arrived here. In 1788, a few more came, making altogether perhaps 1,000, who today, after the lapse of less than a century, number at least 40,000, covering the whole western portion of the state and extending even to the Red and Mississippi. Before the Acadians came, Louisiana seemed to have partaken of the character of the Parisian ancestors. Paris is a terrible consumer of lives. The provinces poured yearly into it thousands of sturdy, hardworking, ambitious men and women, only to be consumed by this monster. All right, and we just continue. The Acadian Proscript, a historical drama in 5 acts. Walter S. Kerr. Moise Dernier, small, alert, weary, swarthy, weaselish in actions, speaking poor French and worse English, concurrently with excessive gesticulation and exclamations, Acadian messenger, an interpreter between the official French and English officers. He who has a hairy appearance with attire that is bizarre, gay, and dirty. All right, Moise Dernier, swarthy, a black Acadian. A black Acadian who can't even speak French or English. What does that tell you? Well, who are the Huguenots originally? In the University of Cambridge. It says here, before race mattered, what archives tell us about early encounters in French colonies? Since the start of the 18th century witnessed a change in attitude on the part of colonizers, French administrators in North America began to argue against interracial marriages, which would mix good French blood with bad Native American blood. 1723, the Colonial Council of Louisiana issued an edict forbidding all Frenchmen and any other subject of the king who are white, dodge the hijack, to marry savage women. The number of mixed marriages dropped, and in 1738, one governor observed that the Illinois Indians do not invite the French to marry their daughters any longer, and the French do not think about this anymore. Children of mixed European and indigenous heritage, Metis, were by the middle. The Metis were a tribe formed. Okay, it was actually the Metis were actually mostly formed by the relationship of the Huguenots and the local indigenous population, whether they were Micmacs or Abenakis or Botoc people. And they became known as Metis, the offspring, which became known as a tribe. I'm telling you real stuff here. They were, by the middle of the 18th century, frequently considered to be inferior. French colonialists complained that Metis children were extremely swarthy and naturally lazy. Now I'm going to ask you a real deep logical question. If these French were white, as they call them here, right? Why would their offspring be so extremely swarthy? You get what I'm saying? So when you mix an Acadian Huguenot with a swarthy Indian, you get extremely swarthy Metis children. Extremely swarthy. All right? Dark complexions were seen as indicators of racial inferiority and the alleged licentiousness and brutishness that had long attributed the natives were increasingly believed to be fixed. Official documents listed colonial populations under headings such as negre, negro, mulatto, metis, mixed, and savage indigenous. All right, they were calling what? Metis, indigenous people, Negroes. How can they be Negroes if they're mixing with French and Indians? Where did the Negro come in? You get what I hope you guys pay attention. All right, how can you call the offspring of a French and an Indian, a Negro, if neither of them are supposed to be Negro, right? But the reality is they were both so-called Negro, and that's why their offspring were extremely swarthy. Extremely swarthy. The Free Library. This is from the book The Call of the Wild, Chapter 1, Into the Primitive. We're talking about a person named Perrault. That was the last he saw of the man in red sweater, and as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of Narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Perrault and turned over to a black-faced giant called Francois. Perrault, a black-faced giant, Francois, with a French name, right? Perrault was a French-Canadian and Swarthy. Perrault was what? French-Canadian and what? Swarthy. Black, right? Black. But Francois was a French-Canadian half-breed and twice as swarthy. Get what they're telling you? So the French were swarthy by themselves. But when they mixed with indigenous people, their offsprings were what? It said here, extremely swarthy or twice as swarthy. Twice as swarthy. All right? Twice as black. They were a new kind of man to buck, of which was destined to see many more. All right? Many more of these offsprings are being created. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. State of Louisiana Department of Education, Acadians of Louisiana, curriculum guide for eighth grade. All right, 8th grade learning here. Let's see, do you remember this? I'd never gotten out like this in the 8th grade. I don't think so. I think I would have remembered. Maybe not. It says here, Henry decided upon Pierre de Goua, also called Gouats, Sieur de Mons and Governor Pons, as the man to take up the task. The Chastists surrendered in death. De Mons had served under Henry in the religious wars and was a Huguenot. All right, De Mons was a Huguenot, a Moor. Ding, 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 word of the day. And was given a monopoly for the fur trade for 10 years. He had a monopoly, this Moorish person, on the fur trade. The Coursier du Bois fur traders were also enslaving American Indians. So this so-called fur trade included people as chattel too, not just fur. De Mons was not a stranger to the New World. He had visited Tadoussac with Chauvin in 1600. All right, that's why they knew him when he came back. And remember, the Indian was like, "Hey, how you guys been? I thought you weren't going to come back." He already knew some of the people. And that experience had caused him to determine that a successful colony could only be settled farther south, away from the dread northern winters. It was to fall to Mons and Champlain, the two Huguenots, all right? Therefore, to form the actual beginnings of New France, which in time was to include Louisiana and a dozen other states of the American Union. These same people, Huguenots, Moors, ended up in Louisiana. Now it says here, marriage à la façon du pays. All right. Marriage à la façon du pays, according to the custom of the country. Ways to practice of common law marriage between European fur traders and Aboriginal or Metis women in the North American fur trade. Canadian historian Sylvia Van Kirk calls them the basis for a fur trade society. It persisted from the early 17th century until it fell out of fashion in the late 19th century due to increasing pressures of Catholic ideology, growing European populations, and a new generation of more desirable mixed breeds, daughters who eventually replaced their native mothers as fur trade wives. All right, listen. Rituals surrounding them were based on a mix of European and indigenous customs, though predominantly the latter. Women played several important roles in the Canadian fur trade. Indigenous women assisted with the survival of the fur traders that all overwintered in North America and eventually became responsible for their care. Europeans knew nothing of the vegetation, wildlife, and seasonal rhythms of North America, so they relied heavily on the indigenous people for their survival. Indigenous women connected the two cultures by being intermediaries. Initially, indigenous women were encouraged to marry fur traders as a way of securing economic resources. These marriages came with the expectation that trade between the woman's relation and the trader would be secured and that mutual aid would be provided in times of need. It secured that the mutual aid would be provided. It was also the hope of the women's family that the trader's generosity would increase after the marriage took place. The marriages between the two groups led to the creation of the Metis people, who are considered the offspring of the fur trade. All right, big one right there. Have you ever heard of the Metis tribe? Basically, they're basically the offspring of the Huguenots and the indigenous local people of Canada in that area. Those who are the Metis tribe. And again, this is the case for many tribes we know today. And I'm going to tell you straight up, and I don't want to hurt nobody's feelings, that includes the 5 civilized tribes. It's okay. It's real history. These people have a deep history too. You guys got to acknowledge the other genealogy. I'm telling you, a lot of the lines end up with these people. Not only did indigenous women play an intimate role with the fur traders, they also played an economic role by producing pemmican. That was a food, like a little meat snack with nuts and stuff that they prepared. It was very nutritional. It was like an energy bar, suitable for winter clothing for their survival. The presence of women in the factories, example, trading post, of what is now Canada had been banned by the Hudson's Bay Company. Those were like slave markets. They just given it fancy names right here. Of what Canada has been banned by Hudson's Bay Company as early as 1683. Intermarriage was common from the start of the fur trade, and by 1739 the company overturned its ban. The practice was both a social and political institution, securing trade relations between Europeans and Aboriginals. Just as intermarriage between tribes was a political instrument of the Aboriginals themselves. All right? And we continue. We're in the William and Mary Quarterly. Says here, to make them like us, European Indian intermarriage in 17th century North America by Jennifer Agnes Jones. Says here, the attitudes of the Jesuit missionaries towards Indians was not one of racial superiority. Rather, like most Europeans in the 17th century, they regarded the Indians as essentially white, right? They wanted them to be white. While settlers in the more temperate climates ascribed the Indians' darker skin to the sun, all right? French settlers believed that the Indians' color had also been affected by the paints and oils they applied to their skin. Again, they believed, they thought, they couldn't know why, they believed. They thought it was the oils into a more rugged condition in their lives in the wild. Father Julian Perrault, remember Perrault was a Huguenot, black man, in a letter to Father Lejeune, espoused a typical attitude about the color and race of the New World Indians. Their skin is naturally white, for the little children show it in dust. He wrote in 1634, so he's saying the babies are born little light-skinned, right? But the heat of the sun and the rubbing of the seal oil and the moose fat make them very swarthy. So when they're adults, they're very swarthy, huh? I mean, I know a lot of so-called black babies that are born very light-skinned, and that's normal. That's almost normal in almost every race. They come out really light at first. All right? The more so as they grow older, very swarthy. How do you turn black? How do you become very black as you grow older and you're white as a baby? You understand they don't make sense. Marie de la Incarnation, an Ursuline nun who moved to Quebec to study school for Indian girls, agreed that the native skin color was the result of external conditions and not indicative of fundamental differences from the French. All right? Not because they're different from the French. You get what they're saying? They're telling you straight up the French are dark. And they're not just like them because it must be the condition. It must be the weather. Not only did French believe the natives to be fundamentally like themselves, they believed the French to be like themselves. They also found them to be very attractive people. Many of the Jesuits wrote with admiration about the natives' physical appearance, stressing their robust health, attractive bodies, and youthful appearance, all right? They loved how the Indians look. They're of lighter build than we are, but handsome, all and well-shaped, commented Father Pierre Bard, superior to the Huron missions. So if an Indian is swarthy, and he's saying they're lighter than him, right? Parbiard must be very swarthy. You do not encounter big-bellied, hunchback, or deformed person among them. He's saying how well in shape they were. You know, they looked very athletic. They weren't, you know, obese or anything like that. They took care of themselves. They weren't hunchback. They weren't deformed. All right. This is how they're describing these people. Huguenots all over Acadia. Moorish people all over Acadia. What does it say here? Francois Charbonneau. I found this and I was really interested. So I took a screenshot of it. All right. Now, it says here, born in St. Nicolas, Maine, France. St. Nicolas, Maine, France on 15 March 1599 to Mathurin Charbonnet and Margaret Surette. Francois Charbonnet married Guillemette Trahan, all right, another Acadian family we're going to get into genealogy. It says here, surname meaning of Charbonneau, French nickname for a man with a dark hair or swarthy complexion, Charbonneau, which is carbon, charbon, carbon. From a diminutive Old French carbon, charcoal, Charbonneau, charcoal, land, carbo. So carbon, charcoal, right? Black like charcoal, dark. That's what Charbonneau means, this surname. Black, swarthy complexion. From migrant to Acadian, North American border people, 1604, 1755, by N.E.S. Griffith. Marriage was important for both European and Amerindians. The majority of those who lived in Acadia during the 17th century, European and Amerindians had their sexual activity shaped by marriage. There was, of course, sexual activity outside of marriage in both societies, but both Mi'kmaq and Europeans had developed customs and institutions that made marriage part of the normal life experience of the majority of adults, men and women alike. In both societies, marriage meant the acknowledgement by some public ceremonial of the commitment to a partnership that was expected to endure, if not until death intervened. At least for some considerable period of time, there were significant variations in the actual experience of marriage, not only from one society to the next, but from one generation to the next, but also between couples within the same society and within the same generation, right? You guys get the point, right? This was a common thing. It was going on. Micmacs, all that, all these people mixing in. It was happening a lot to the point where you're getting tribes out of it. People call themselves the Metis. An ethnographic report on the Acadian Metis, people of Southwest Nova Scotia. Early Acadian Metis ancestry, having examined documents concerning Joseph Moise Deasy the first and his Metis origins, it is worth returning to the above-mentioned Nova Scotia Council minutes records given by Lieutenant Governor Paul Mascarene. All right, remember that Paul Mascarene, we already got it. He was a Huguenot. Mascarene was a Huguenot. These minutes are especially relevant to the family of Joseph, the first son, Joseph Moise Deasy II, given his ancestry and the fact that the mixed-blooded Acadians who were residing where he was in 1744 were referred to collectively as distinctively as mulattoes. Mulattoes, Indians and Acadians being called mulattoes. Remember, mulatto a lot of times just meant a mixture between two nations, not black and white. All right, just a mixture of two nations. All right, these facts concerning the background of Joseph de Moise are essentially important when combined with the excerpt taken from a letter written by Pierre Jean Magde Sigoni to Monsignor John Active Plessis in 1809 concerning the 5 couples who required dispensations to marry. Down here again, Huguenots, a popular term used in 1560 to designate what? French Protestants, some of whom became involved in the Newfoundland fishery and Canadian fur trade and abortive colonization attempts in Canada, Brazil, and the Carolinas. Who? Huguenots, Moors, right? The Moors became known as Huguenots. Remember? Huguenots, popular term. French Protestants. Who's the Protestants? Protestant. Cryptos. Cryptos. A trickle of Huguenots continued to find their way to Canada, and Acadia's merchants, artisans, soldiers, fishermen, indentured servants, and even filles du roi. All right, was that wives? They were forced to live as good Catholics by attending mass. All right, they were forced to be Catholics. The Cajuns, they weren't always Catholics. They were forced, eventually becoming Catholic, accepting it, because eventually a lot of generations past, people don't really care about their heritage and they forget who they are. By attempting mass and having their marriages solemnized by church and their children baptized by the priest, secretly, many continue to hold their reformed religious convictions. Secretly, what? Secret crypto? Secretly, they what? They still were Sephardic Moorish Muslims. Secretly. In 1683, the intendant complained to the authorities in Versailles that at least 60 heretics, when they call them Muslims, heretics, had left the colony for neighboring English Protestant colonies. They went where the good English were, or the Protestant English were most likely their own people. Following the revocation of Edict of 1965, some leading merchants were forced either to abjure Protestantism or to return to France. Amérique, les Huguenots à Canada, the Huguenots in Acadia. The year 2004 marks the 400th anniversary of the founding of Acadia by Pierre de Goua, or Gas, Comme de Mons, a Huguenot, a Moor. Ding, 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 ding. Word of the day, Moor. Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour. Saint-Étienne, I see that name in Haiti a lot. Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour was a French colonist and fur trader who served as governor of Acadia. And again, in 1653-1657. Says Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour was born in France in 1593 to a Huguenot, so he's a Huguenot. Huguenot de Saint-Étienne de Tours and his wife, Marie Amador de Salazar. All right, so he was a Huguenot, right? The 1610 expedition also included Portugal's 19-year-old son, Charles de Bearnecourt, St. Just, and a Catholic priest who set about the task of baptizing the local Mi'kmaq people, including their chief, Memberto. All right? So, Charles de Bearnecourt, as we're going to read here in the Atlantic Reading to Confederation, a history, edited by Philip A. Buckner and John G. Reed, says the first marriages of Charles de la Tour, one of the most important men in early Acadian history, again, a Moor, one of the most important men, he's a Moor of Acadian history, was with a Mi'kmaq, all right, with an indigenous. Remember the Mi'kmaqs earlier, right? They were described as what? Swarthy. Two so-called black people. If you want to get technical, today's terms, right? Or if they're living in America, they'd be called African Americans. And they have nothing to do with Africa. Nothing to do with Africa. It says here the history of Kings County, Nova Scotia, heart of the Acadian land, given a sketch of the French and their expulsion, and a history of the New England planters who came in their stead. So this is specifies the people who actually took them over. The first settled pastor of Cornwallis New Light Church after the death of Mr. Aline was the Reverend John Payson. The Payson family, like the Alines, lived in Falmouth, and there John Payson had married a sister of Henry Aline. Payson's ancestors had been staunch Huguenots, had been what? Moors, Muslims. But for a time he himself had studied at Quebec for the priesthood of Roman Catholic Church. He was coming to be, he wanted to be connected and liked. He wanted to go down with the Catholics, all right? Payson, Huguenot. How many Huguenots we're going to read about today, guys? The Acadian French. In 84 years from the beginning of the settlement to Minos, the Rivière-aux-Canards district comprised 21 hamlets, and from 3 to 80 inhabitants each. The Minos district comprised 70 hamlets, with from 3 to 94 inhabitants each. According to Herbin, the name of the Canard hamlets were Antoine, Aquan, Brune, Claude, Laundry, Claude, Tarot, Camus, Delandry, Dupuis, Francois, Granger, Herbert, Jean Theroux, Miquel, Navy, Pinos, Poirier, Saulnier. Remember Saulnier? That was Muslim. Strahan. These are the names we kind of went over earlier, as you guys can see. So it's the original narratives of early American history. Voyages of Samuel de Champlain, the actual guy who founded Quebec and the Huguenot who helped found Acadia and Quebec. He actually wrote a book, right, of what he experienced during his voyages with the Indians and everything. And it says here on page 51 of his book, all these people of Nuremberg are very swarthy, dressed in beaver skins and other furs like the Canadian and Iroquois savages. They have the same mode of life. And I just want to emphasize that the Iroquois, they weren't really spelled like that, but they're not the same as the Iroquois. The Iroquois means salty people, or from the salt, from the Hudson Bay, which is an ocean, the salt. They deal with salt, and a lot of them were enslaved too by French, or mixed in, as we see today. But he's saying a major drop here. All these people of Nuremberg were very swarthy, very dark, adding an expression, very dark, very swarthy, very black. Where is Nuremberg? Nuremberg. Nuremberg is a legendary settlement in northeastern North America. They say legendary because when the Vikings and all that history of all that, they went to Nuremberg. Yeah, they were here. Nuremberg was a real place. It's not legendary. That's why they had maps from 1570 showing Nova Scotia as Nuremberg. And that's why this guy just said Nuremberg. He's not thinking nothing of it during his time. In the 1600s, he's calling Nova Scotia Nuremberg. Yeah, the legendary place the Vikings and Eric the Red and all these people went to. Yeah, that was there. That was a real place. Nuremberg, again, which was featured on many early maps from the 1500s until European colonization of the region. And it says here, continuing in the same book that he wrote, the Huguenot. The Huguenot is the one writing this, all right? He's a black man. And he's saying all these people are well-proportioned in body without deformity and are agile. The women also are well-formed, plump, and of a swarthy color in consequence of certain pigments with which they rub. So they keep saying that they rub oils and that's why, no, they're swarthy like that. That's their natural color. And who do we have here? Matthew da Costa. Matthew da Costa was a member of the exploring party of the Pierre Dugois. Remember the Huguenot? So Matthew, the famous Matthew da Costa, who I talked about in my Columbus and his Negro friends video about the black conquistadors. He was one of these guys. He was one of these black conquistadors known in history as a black man. They allowed people to know because they couldn't hide his pictures. They couldn't hide his descriptions. So they turned him into half African or half free black, right? I was going to read about him a little bit. He was actually with Pierre Dugas. He was with Desmonts and Champlain. They were all Huguenots, right? What does that tell you about him and about the Da Costa family? The Da Costa, remember the Da Costas? We did a video in South Carolina. I showed you that the Irish Da Costas were black Irish, who were most likely the same family of this Da Costa, eventually Sephardic or Moorish people coming from Spain and Portugal. That's why it's Da Costa, right? Da Costa, yeah, they were black slave owners. They were listed as black Irish or mulatto Irish in the census. I showed that. If you haven't seen my video, make sure to catch that video as well. My South Carolina video. All right? The Da Costas. Who were the Da Costas, black Irish, in that case over there in South Carolina, I believe. Now, again, we got this Matthew Da Costa traveling with 3 Huguenots. And I know the Costa family. Most likely he's a Huguenot too, a Moor, right? Right? He was the first recorded free black person to arrive on the territory of today's Canada. Dodge the hijack. He's the first one they're allowing you to accept as a free black. Raccoon ass is here. The relationship of class and persecution and reclaiming Cajun identity from 1960 to 1990 by Kaylin Caron. All right, General Honors, 2011. Says the history of the Cajuns was relatively limited until 1970 and represented Cajuns in stereotypical ways, portrayed in traveler sketch as hallowed by the magic of Longfellow or by national interest magazines as simple, these anecdotes of Cajun life were far from deep and instead reflected the bias against any French presence in southern Louisiana. The Cajuns depicted in these texts were interchangeable with Acadians, all right? They're the same people, but some distinction was made as to terminology. A traveler knows not to call them Cajuns because it is an insult and remarks on the multi ethnic Native American and white heritage of some of the people. However, instead of being portrayed as positive ethnic diversity, this imagery contributes to the image of Cajuns as dirty, swarthy people. Cajuns, Swarthy, Acadians, Swarthy. Of course, they're Swarthy. We know Acadians are Swarthy. All right. Again, we're in all different sources here, right? And they're trying to explain why Cajuns are getting this derogative term, Swarthy, dirty people. We're in another article here. It says ethnic self-identification and symbolic stereotyping, the portrayal of Louisiana Cajuns. The upper part of Pointe Coupe, next to the Mississippi River, is inhabited by the Acadians. Pointe Coupe. A lot of people's genealogy have done come out of there. Born without much industry, they appear to be in the same state of mediocrity they were in when they arrived in the colony. Without ambition or desire, they live in a situation nearing poverty. Poor, on their habitations where they mostly cultivate small plots of land without outside help. This class of settlers is exceedingly dirty. Their houses seem better fitted to lodge animals than men. Acadians are generally good and hospitable. They never let a stranger in without offering refreshments, but one must be hungry to eat the dishes they prepare. Oh man, that's an insult right there. The depiction of Cajuns in the second period from 1880 to 1960 is more complex and complete, and this period can be seen as a formative time of the Cajun stereotype. 14 of 15 categories appear in at least 40% of accounts, and 6 appear in over 60% of accounts. Although language appears in most accounts with reference to limited abilities of Cajuns to speak either French or English, occupations, activities, and personal traits gather the greatest number of references. Acadian origin, relative poverty, and a slow propensity to change also emerge as dominant traits. Domains gain in diversity, added to the farming dimension. The portrayal of Cajuns as fishermen and collectors foraging for fur, moss, or lumber becomes dominant. Mentions of a few manufacturing activities, mostly basket making and textile, and professions also increase. Mentions of balls, music, amusement, gambling, cuisine are ubiquitous, and more complete portrait of Cajuns, all right? Personal qualities is drawn. Swarthy. Again, they're Swarthy. Cajuns are Acadians, right? They like gambling, music, and food. Cajuns' propensity for eating, dancing, drinking, playing music, and gambling is ubiquitously noted and constitutes the bulk of non-occupational activities recorded. All right? Activities belong to 3 major classes: foodways, joie de vivre, which includes dancing, playing music, gambling, and Mardi Gras. All right? Mardi Gras, all right? Mentions of foodway and joie de vivre account for approximately 80% of reported activities. There's a remarkable continuity between early remarks that Acadians are excessively attached to balls and parties. Acadians like balls and parties, right? Remember, a lot of the Acadians were already mixed with Indians, right? So maybe they getting it from that too, the culture, right? 19th century knows that they endorsed the carnivals to its wildest extent. And recent headlines claim that in Southwest Louisiana, entire towns, partly from dawn to the wee hours in a last ecstatic hurrah before Lent, games and gambling were and also remain frequently mentioned, whether they involve horses, cockfights, or cards. Exploring the Huguenot legacy, and I just wanted to leave with this. I thought this was very interesting. It's a deep article, and I was like, I can't read all these articles, but I wanted to show you guys. Exploring the Huguenot legacy in South Carolina. How an exiled French Acadian family made Baptist and Presbyterian history. All right, I'm gonna leave it like that. How did Baptist religions, these Christian sects, and why is it so common or practiced or believed? The religion amongst so-called black people. There's a true history behind this, and it wasn't white masters. And that's where we're going to end it today, guys. This was a very long presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed it. and I hope it's valuable to you guys. I mean, I don't know when this is going to become mainstream and when other so-called scholars are going to put all this together. There was a lot of research that had to go on before I even realized what to research. You know, I had to learn what a Huguenot was. I had to realize it was Black Europeans. I had to realize there was Black Indians. And I had to learn about genealogy. There's a lot of things that led me to this information. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you for tuning in. Blessings. Love y'all. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you guys soon. Hawa.